This game has seen tens of millions of players, hundreds of battles, and dozens of turning points with unexpected comebacks. But she was the only one who overcame all the challenges and competitions. Only she was able to hold out until the end and win. She didn't run away, but instead she went straight ahead without hesitation and ultimately brought the virtual reality legend to life. This is a player worth remembering forever, the first streamer champion, Shin Haim. Her reaction speed was a split second, and her intuition was on the verge of providence. Unprecedented and inimitable mechanics. She surpassed all expectations of the player and became a legend. After such a performance, Shin Ha-young was definitely looking forward to his professional debut, and everyone bid farewell to the winner until next season. 6 years have passed since then. Life at the RSD Center went on as usual. The corridors filled with hurried footsteps in the mornings, screens flickered with streams of data, and the routine took on an almost hypnotic rhythm. The gaming capsules were ready to receive players, their smooth bodies quietly pulsating with a soft light, as if secretly awaiting the moment when someone else's heartbeat would begin to beat within them again. The glass door of one of them quietly opened, making a barely perceptible click. It was interesting to hear the opinion of the player sitting in it. The frozen expression on his face betrayed neither excitement nor delight, and this composure was more intriguing than any words. After all, the center's research director, Ojihi, knew for sure that this guy hadn't played for a long time. He honestly said that his head was spinning less than before, and in this simple phrase there was a barely perceptible note of relief, as if an invisible burden had finally fallen from his shoulders, and his body felt much lighter. He wiggled his fingers, as if getting used to his own weight again, and paused for a moment, listening to this unfamiliar feeling of freedom. Then Jae-hee invited him to look at the new game capsule, her voice sounding calm. But there was a hint of subdued anticipation in it, like that of an inventor ready to show off his best creation. This new capsule utilized cutting-edge technology to push performance to the limit. Every sensor, every algorithm was tailored to blur the line between reality and simulation. Thanks to her, even people with vices could play, and this was not just a technical victory, but a promise to give back to those who had already come to terms with their limitations the opportunity to once again feel part of a limitless world. This also applied to Sojun. With his low synchronization rate, there wouldn't be any problems even with long-term use. Then he decided to clarify the price of this capsule. The question slipped out of his mouth almost involuntarily, as if deep down there was still a tiny hope that the price would not be as terrifying as he had imagined. Ji-hye happily announced that it cost 1 million won, her voice ringing with genuine excitement, as if this figure were not a barrier but a pass into a world of incredible opportunities. Hearing such a sum, Sojun became sad, his shoulders involuntarily slumped, and a bitter feeling stirred in his chest, as if the treasured door that had opened before him had suddenly slammed shut. The price was steep and definitely out of his reach, as he only had 458 won in his account, a paltry sum that wasn't even worth a test session, and that realization made him feel particularly bitter for a moment. But Ji-hye had a special proposition for him that should interest him. A sly, almost conspiratorial glimmer flickered in her eyes, and a slight smile hinted that the conversation was far from over. The capsule was a device that fulfilled every desire of modern people, opening up virtual reality to all types of industries. From educational simulations to cinematic attractions, it promised to erase the boundaries between dreams and reality. But among all the possibilities, people were inclined to only one. The one that stirred the blood and made the heart beat faster, promising not comfort and coziness, but sharp, burning emotions. Finding yourself in dark dungeons or wild wastelands, where monsters awaited, each with its own habits and deadly attacks, became the main attraction, luring players into bottomless labyrinths of danger. Sharpening combat techniques, collecting legendary weapons, and learning to exploit monsters' weaknesses in battle was a task that required pushing the limits of one's abilities, where every mistake could cost a character their life, and victory offered an incomparable triumph. And exploring the vast lands, from scorched deserts to snow-capped mountains, wasn't just entertainment, but a true odyssey. where secrets lurked around every corner, capable of changing the fate of an entire virtual world. It was a game world. It was distinguished by an incredible realism, so deep and all-encompassing that the line between fiction and reality was erased in a matter of seconds, and one could completely forget that this was a game, feeling every gust of wind, every drop of rain as true, living reality. And everything was seasoned with bright skills. They flared with blinding flashes, accompanied by deafening sounds and powerful vibrations, turning every action into a spectacular, almost cinematic spectacle. Many were drawn into the games, as if an invisible funnel was picking them up, carrying them away from the gray, everyday life. Capsule fever gripped the world, spreading across cities like a wildfire, engulfing offices and apartments, displacing former hobbies and dictating a new rhythm of life, where gaming achievements became the primary measure of success. However, less than a year had passed before Sojun began to lose consciousness right inside the capsule. In an instant, the bright image before my eyes faded, my body went limp, and the connection with the virtual world was cut off with frightening suddenness. But one day he saw a bright advertisement for a new capsule. A comfortable game was now possible, even with a low score. This thought pulsated in Sojun's head like a tiny flame of hope, and he involuntarily caught himself feeling a long-forgotten anticipation flaring up in his chest again, as if the door he had been unsuccessfully tugging at for so long had finally opened before him. But the price tag of $1 million in his case was an unaffordable sum. The figure froze before his eyes like an icy barrier. Moreover, it was rather expensive for an ordinary hobby. The thought scratched the consciousness with a bitter irony. Spending a fortune on something that for most people was just a way to while away an evening seemed almost absurd, and because of this, the desire was mixed with an awkward feeling of guilt. If he hadn't played at all, he wouldn't have thought so much about returning to gaming. That simple truth sometimes hit him like a stone, making him grit his teeth in frustration. Sojun sincerely didn't understand why he got involved in all this. In the evening, when almost everyone was already asleep, a bright light was burning in their window. The Korean champion Shin Hae-young was shown on TV. Her silhouette on the screen was clear and confident. Every movement was precise, as if she wasn't just playing, but dictating her own rules to the game itself, and this pressure involuntarily attracted the eye, even if you didn't want to delve into it. Sojun's roommate, Kim Tae-woo, was a veteran streamer and watched the action on screen with great interest. Returning home, Sojun asked him what he was watching at such a loud volume. The question came out almost automatically, mixed with the fatigue of the day, and it was not so much curiosity that was reflected, but a desire to cling to something ordinary, earthly, to briefly emerge from his heavy thoughts. This was a special Streamer League event. Tae-woo said the words with a barely perceptible breathiness, and his voice carried the same passion that distinguishes true fans. For him, this wasn't just a tournament, but the culmination of months of anticipation and sleepless nights. Sojun didn't pay much attention to their popularity, but he noticed their ads were everywhere. Kim Tae-woo thought his neighbor was crazy for still asking if the league was popular. The Streamers League was a massive success, not just attracting viewers, but literally transforming everyday life. It had 15 million viewers worldwide, a figure that sounded almost like science fiction. But screens, broadcasts, and endless online discussions proved that this was not an exaggeration, but a new reality, where a virtual duel could eclipse any real event. A regular tournament in Korea alone would attract 1 million views. And if you include international viewers, the event would become a massive league with millions of viewers. And this growing buzz of interest was like an approaching storm that could no longer be ignored. Outside of the Pro League, this was the largest competition of any such tournament. Its scale overwhelming, causing even the most confident players to gulp nervously as they imagined how many eyes would be watching their every move. The most common weapons there were bows and magic. They beckoned with their spectacularity, flashed with dazzling effects, and promised an easy victory to those who knew how to skillfully combine skills. But swords were beyond competition. Their raw, straightforward power held a special appeal. They did not forgive mistakes, demanded absolute precision, and that is precisely why they became the choice of those who wanted to prove they were worthy of standing at the top. Hearing this, Sojun couldn't help but think. His fingers tightened slightly, as if they were already feeling the familiar grip, and a long-forgotten feeling stirred in his chest, from which he felt both hot and cold at the same time. But as Kim Tai-woo explained, using a sword offered no guarantees. He had tried fencing for the past year only to be sent straight into the ditch, a bitter truth laced with the weariness of the endless defeats that seemed to dog him. But then Sojun suddenly said that any streamer could participate, even an unpopular one, and his words struck Kim right in the heart, as if someone had abruptly opened the door behind which was hidden a dream he was afraid to even think about. He thought he was doing well, since unpopular people weren't invited to the league. Kim asked why Sojun was suddenly interested in this since streaming hadn't really bothered him much before. But he didn't have time to answer. He was interrupted by the sharp, insistent ringing of his phone. Sojun looked closely at the screen of his mobile phone. The lines of notification flashed before his eyes, and in that moment the rest of the world seemed to shrink to the size of a small rectangle pulsating in his hand. Oh Jihye wrote him a message and asked if he had made a decision on her proposal. Her words sounded calm, but in this restraint there was a hidden insistence, as if she knew that she was on the threshold of something important. She announced that this time, at the league tournament, organized by Travel, a new capsule model would be presented as the main prize, a phrase that hung in the air like a glittering lure, simultaneously enticing and terrifying. And if Sojun decides to participate in the tournament, he will be able to use it for free until its end. An opportunity that seemed almost unbelievable suddenly lay before him like an open door, beckoning into the unknown. This information made him think, his thoughts whirling. Oh Jihye waited for Sojun's answer, her anticipation hanging in the air like a taut string. And then he told Kim that he was thinking about taking part in the tournament. The words sounded firm, almost defiant, as if he had already taken a step forward and was now not going to back down. Hearing this, Kim was taken aback. His eyes widened and his mouth opened slightly, but not a single word came out. But Sojun repeated his answer, this time even more confidently, as if every word he spoke strengthened his resolve, turning a fragile idea into a solid plan. He was confident that he would not lose face if he tried his luck there. There was no bravado in this confidence, only the cool, collected determination of a man who knows the value of his skills and is ready to prove it in action. Kim didn't immediately find the right words to answer. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something, but then immediately closed it again because no single phrase could contain the entire whirlwind of emotions raging inside him. And then he started saying that the league wasn't some lousy talent show. And did he really think anyone could participate in it? His voice was thick with despair and fear for his friend, who he thought was about to step into the abyss without looking down. The question of why he even wanted to return to capsule games kept swirling around in Sojun's head, trying to catch it by the tail. Perhaps because he wanted to taste again the glory in which he basked as the god of the sword, the image of those days flashed in his memory in dazzling images. Or perhaps because he remembered his past life, not just episodes, but the very essence of that time, when every movement was honed to perfection, and fear was something distant and almost unreal. And those bright moments came flooding back to him, coming in waves, one after another, each one like a heartbeat, reminding him of who he once was. As he fought single-handedly against multiple enemies at once, his blade flickered through the air, becoming a blurry silver spot, and time seemed to slow down, allowing him to see every detail and anticipate his opponent's every move. He remembered his beautiful sword, its balance, its weight, that special, barely perceptible ringing with which it cut through the air, and how the hilt fit perfectly in the palm of his hand, becoming an extension of his arm, and the ease with which he crushed everyone around him. This ease was not just skill, but a state of mind when everything came together. Strength, speed, intuition. And the world submitted to his will. Sojun always came out on top. That thought was like an anchor in the raging sea of doubt, a reminder that he wasn't just a player, but someone who could prevail even in the most hopeless situations. And now he really wanted to return to this world, not for the sake of glory or a prize, but for the sake of that very feeling when you stand on the tip of a blade and the whole world freezes in anticipation of your next step. Sojun was haunted by memories, replaying in his mind over and over again. He saw a secret black market unfolding under the full moon, dark silhouettes, the whispers of deals, the scent of fear and despair permeating the air. And this landscape, seared into his memory, seemed more real than anything that surrounded him now. And there, at the very bottom, a special commodity was waiting for its moment. It froze in this picture as if in a trap, and a chill ran down my spine from the realization of who exactly that commodity was put up for auction. That slave was Sojun in his past life. The thought struck him with a merciless directness, depriving him of air, and he froze for a moment, as if he again felt the weight of the chains and the emptiness that was eating away at him from within. But one day, everything changed. This turning point was stored in memory like a flash of light in the middle of pitch darkness. The stranger asked if the boy would like to come with him, simple words that sounded like an offer from another world, and within them lay a chance to escape the nightmare that he barely dared to accept. At that very moment the teacher appeared. His figure seemed to appear out of nowhere, but it felt so firm and strong that even the darkest shadows seemed to retreat as soon as he took a step forward. And he was a salvation, not loud, not spectacular, but quiet, but unconditional, and it was this calm confidence that became the first ray of hope for Sojun. It was the past of a genius rescued from the clutches of despair, a story that no one knew but him and his teacher, and it was both his curse and his strength forever determining his path. The heavy burden of responsibility for the righteous path amidst malice and inflated expectations fell on the shoulders like lead, and every step forward was achieved at the cost of an internal struggle where the slightest weakness could cost too much. And Sojun himself from his past life, who was nicknamed the God of the Sword, would not have existed at all. This bitter truth sometimes burned from within, without a teacher, without his lessons, without that very spark that he ignited in him. He would have remained a nameless slave on the black market. Sojun remembered his teacher with warmth, but what use was that title to him now? In those moments, pride seemed like an empty phrase, and the memories a heavy burden that he carried, not knowing where to put it. But suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by words about him going crazy. Kim's sharp voice burst into his inner world like a rude push, returning him to reality, where his plans looked not like a path to salvation, but like madness. Sojun even asked again what Kim had told him. He froze for a second, as if he couldn't believe his ears, and this question didn't so much reflect misunderstanding as it did the hope that he had simply misheard. Such a purchase simply for the sake of participating in the league defied common sense. Kim's words rang with a sober logic that made him uneasy because it mercilessly shattered his dreams of something great into petty, inconvenient facts. Kim asked if he even knew the requirements for participating in the tournament. His gaze became harder and his tone more insistent, as if he was trying to get through to Sojun. He needed to be recognizable in the streaming world, otherwise he wouldn't be able to participate. This simple truth hit Sojun like an icy wave, revealing the fragility of his plan and making him doubt his own resolve. But becoming popular wasn't that easy. Behind this not that easy lay a whole abyss of work, sleepless nights, and endless attempts to break through the wall of audience indifference. The player's skills spoke for him. His pure skill, honed to a shine, became his voice when words failed, and it was this that had to convince the audience of his worth. His game sense, his instinct, his ability to anticipate events a split second before others became an invisible weapon that couldn't be bought or copied. And of course, humor, lightness, the ability to make people laugh, and the ability to win people over were sometimes as important as impeccable technique, as spectators came not only to watch victories but also to feel a connection with the players. Even video processing was important. Every detail, from color correction to editing, contributed to the image, and neglecting this meant voluntarily abandoning part of your audience. And even if you pump up all this, there is still a risk of failure because there are no views. This cruel reality hangs over every aspiring streamer like the sword of Damocles, reminding them that even perfect content can go unnoticed. Kim wondered how he was going to succeed if he hadn't really played capsule games, and his question sounded not only confused but also genuinely concerned for his friend who seemed about to jump into the raging sea without a life jacket. But one thought came to Sojun's mind. It flared up in his mind like a bright spark, driving away doubts, and at that moment he again felt that very confidence that once made him invincible. He wanted to try using the skill. Hearing this, Kim realized that he was dealing with a persistent asshole. There was no anger in this rude thought, rather a bitter recognition that arguing with such stubbornness was useless and perhaps even unnecessary. But there was another way to become better than the #1 pro player in Korea, Shin Hae-young, a goal that sounded almost like a challenge to fate, daring and dangerous, but it was precisely in such a large-scale task that Sojun felt at home. Sojun was sure that he was better than her, and he had plenty of experience in the capsule. It was just that it had been a long time ago. There was no bragging in his confidence. Only a cold, verified assessment of his strength based on the years when he really was the best. Hearing this, Kim decided that he was out of his mind. His face was momentarily distorted by a mixture of horror and admiration, as if he was looking at a man ready to step off a cliff and sincerely believing that he could fly. He decided to teach Seo-jun a lesson, not out of cruelty, but out of a desire to bring him back to earth, to show him how big the gap was between dreams and reality, and to give him a chance to come to his senses before it was too late. If he really turned out to be cooler than Shin Hae-young, or at least better than Kim, then he promised to take on all the chores around the house. This bet, thrown almost in jest, was in fact a test of strength, and both understood that the stakes here were much higher than just cleaning. Sojun was ready to accept such conditions. He nodded without hesitation, because for him this was not just an argument, but a way to prove, not only to Kim, but also to himself, that the past had not been erased without a trace. The lid of the game capsule slammed shut. A heavy metallic sound cut him off from the outside world, and for a split second everything around froze in tense silence. He connected to virtual reality. Loading bars swam before his eyes, and the familiar sensation of transitioning from one world to another once again overwhelmed him, awakening long-dormant instincts. In general, Seo-jun had never been interested in streaming. The field seemed alien and distant to him, filled with alien rules and alien ambitions, and he didn't see anything in it that could attract him. But he remembered the words of his teacher. They surfaced in his memory with crystal clarity, as if the teacher was standing next to him and whispering them right in his ear, reminding him of the most important thing. Everyone started out not in what they were good at, but in what was difficult. A phrase that once seemed unfair now took on new meaning, becoming the key to understanding how true masters are born. And if you hesitate because of a lack of experience, you will never achieve anything. These words contained a harsh but necessary truth that cut off all excuses and left only one thing: to act no matter what. A bright flash cut him off from reality. Seo-jun felt familiar with the place where the virtual reality had transported him. Kim Tae-woo also entered the training ground, his footsteps sounding dull, and he paused for a second, looking around, not yet fully realizing that the game had already begun. He didn't even expect that Seo-jun was already there. This surprise made him momentarily confused, because he was used to being the one who first seized space and dictated the terms. Kim explained that they were on the training grounds of the capsule's pre-installed game, his voice sounding a little more tense than usual, and there was a hint of a desire to regain control of the situation before things got out of hand. Here, they had to compete against artificial intelligence and set a record. The rules were simple, but merciless. Only the strongest could leave their mark on this digital annals. Sojun asked if they could just fight, a question that was filled with impatience, a desire to test themselves here and now without unnecessary formalities and lengthy preparations. But Kim replied that he had to understand how much he had to restrain himself so as not to injure him, and there was concern mixed with irritation in his words because he did not want to be responsible for someone else's recklessness. The artificial intelligence had 10 levels. Each of them was a step on the way to the top, and with each new level, the tests became more merciless. And as they increased, the bot became stronger, its reactions quickened, its tactics became more complex, and the player's mistakes were punished instantly and harshly. The latter impersonated the person with the best record among those who had passed the 9th level, and this position had belonged to Shin Ha-young for 5 years in a row, this information hanging in the air like an invisible challenge, a reminder of who he would ultimately have to face. But to be able to challenge the 10th level, one had to reach the 9th. It was a mandatory barrier, an insurmountable wall against which the hopes of many an ambitious player were dashed. And this was not at all easy to do. The 9th level weeded out everyone who relied on luck or superficial skills, leaving only those who were willing to pay the real price for the right to rise higher. While Kim was looking at the monitor, Sojun had already made the transition to the duel phase. His movements were quick and precise, devoid of fuss, and it seemed that he was acting not according to a plan, but on instinct. The match with the bot was about to begin. The counter was counting down the final seconds, and the air in the arena seemed to thicken with tension, awaiting the first blow. Kim didn't even notice how Sojun chose an opponent and what level he took. He was distracted for just a moment, and when he looked at the screen again, the battle was already in full swing. The bot, sword in hand, was already rushing towards Sojun. Its movements were mechanically perfect, calculated down to the millimeter, and in this perfection lay a special threat. Their swords clashed, sparks flying. The sound of the impact echoed across the arena like thunder, and from that second on, time seemed to slow down, stretching each moment into eternity. Kim chuckled, deciding that Sojun was just an idiot for deciding to take the 9th level right away. His laughter was a mixture of distrust and pity, as if he were looking at a person who was digging a hole for himself. He thought that his neighbor was driven only by self-conceit. This thought seemed the most logical to him, and he was already preparing himself for the fact that everything would end in a humiliating defeat. The bot went on the attack again, its blade describing a deadly arc, and any other player in Sojun's place would have already been defeated. But he managed to block it, his sword meeting the blow with such precision and force that even Kim froze for a second, not believing his eyes. And then he dealt heavy damage to the robot. The damaged figure flashed on the screen, and this bright reflection seemed to confirm that what was happening was not a dream or an accident. His health bar had dropped sharply by another quarter. The loss was palpable. And for the first time in a long time, Kim felt something akin to anxiety stir within him. Looking at this, Kim decided that Sojun was just lucky. This saving thought helped him maintain his usual confidence, although deep down he already understood that it was not a matter of luck. The robot launched into a new attack, its movements now carrying the fury of a machine insulted by the fact that its flawless plan had been shattered. But Sojun's sword gave him no chance, moving with such speed and precision that the blade seemed an extension of his arm, and every movement was part of a single deadly dance. It slashed across the metal, and a loud clang echoed around him like the cry of a wounded animal. And then a series of new blows followed. They merged into a continuous stream, leaving the bot not a second to breathe, and each blow brought the denouement closer. The bot's hand shot up, and for a moment it froze in a ridiculous gesture, as if trying to defend itself. But it was too late, and then it flew off to the side, unable to withstand another blow from Sojun. The metal limb described an arc and fell down as if a symbol of the fact that the superiority of the machine was an illusion. The robot's limb fell to the floor with a clang, the sound sounding like a final chord, emphasizing that the balance of power in the arena had finally shifted. Kim couldn't believe what he was seeing and stood there with his mouth open in amazement. All his ideas about Sojun's capabilities crumbled to dust, and he suddenly felt like a spectator on a strange, incredible stage. The robot sank to the floor, its body shaking, and its remaining systems tried to compensate for the loss, but it already looked like agony. He wanted to take his hand back, but Sojun pinned it with his foot. This gesture was not cruel, but demonstrative, like a seal on a sentence that could no longer be appealed. The robot looked at him silently, and in that silent, emotionless gaze one could still read something like respect for the opponent, who turned out to be stronger. And he was already rejoicing, feeling his victory and superiority. The fire of triumph was blazing inside him, the same one that had once made him a legend, and now he felt alive again. And the next moment there was a sword strike on the bot's neck, a sharp, precise movement that ended the fight with one final, flawless stroke. A short circuit flashed across the room, and the bot jerked and froze forever. The lights dimmed, and silence fell over the arena, broken only by the victor's heavy breathing. Thus, Sojun had won this level 9th duel. This victory was more than just a statistic, but proof that his skills hadn't faded, but were merely biding their time. Kim was in shock. He looked at the screen, then at Sojun, then back at the screen, and not a single thought could fit into the usual picture of the world. But this meant that Sojun would now move on to level 10. The next step was not just a test, but a transition to an entirely different league where the stakes were higher and mistakes were fatal. And there his only enemy was waiting for him, the one who held the top for years, and to challenge him meant putting everything you had on the line. It meant a fight with Shin Hyung. The name sounded in the silence, like a sentence and a promise at the same time, and it contained the whole meaning of this crazy path. Looking at this picture, a bead of sweat rolled down Kim's face, slowly rolling down, emphasizing the tension of the moment, and in this small, almost imperceptible movement, the whole gamut of his emotions was reflected: fear, admiration, and disbelief. He couldn't figure out what was wrong with this Sojun. There was something about him that went beyond ordinary talent, and Kim felt like he had witnessed something truly rare, perhaps even historic. One of the RSD Center employees couldn't understand why the director needed all this. She frowned, looking from the capsule to Ojie and back, as if trying to find a hidden catch in this generosity that eluded her understanding. But Ojie didn't immediately understand what she was talking about. Her thoughts were occupied with something completely different. It turned out that they were talking about a free rental of a new capsule, because that was too generous, and the employee's eyes showed genuine bewilderment, as if offering such an offer to a stranger was akin to throwing away jewelry at a crossroads. The employee understood perfectly well that Sojun was in no way fit to be a league participant. She had seen the statistics, knew the requirements, and couldn't shake the feeling that the director was risking the center's reputation for a dubious venture. But Oh Ji-hye simply couldn't stand to watch talent go to waste. Those rare moments when Sojun seemed to stop being an ordinary player and turn into someone more, someone who could rewrite the rules, were too vivid in her memory. Even when he didn't reach the passing level of synchronization, she considered him amazing. In his mistakes, she saw not weakness, but a spark that only needed to be ignited correctly, and this faith lived in her despite all the reports and figures. And since then, his skills have improved significantly. The changes were not just noticeable, they were stunning, as if the sleeping giant inside him that had been waiting for its moment for years had finally awakened. But the girl correctly noted that Sojun might not have made it into the league. This bitter truth hung between them like an invisible barrier, and Oh Ji-hye didn't try to deny it because she knew the path would be thorny. But Oh Ji-hye knew for sure that if he succeeded, he would defeat anyone. There was no blind faith in this confidence, only a cold calculation based on what she saw in his eyes. There was no fear of the strongest opponents, only the excitement of a hunter who had gone out to hunt big game. So the new game capsule was given to him for free, a decision made not according to the rules, but from the heart. And although some considered it a mistake, for her, it was the only possible choice. The fight between Sojun and Shin Hyam was in full swing. The arena shook from the force of the collisions. The air was thick with tension, and every blow sent an electric shock through the chests of the spectators. Kim looked at him with completely different eyes. There was no longer condescension or irritation in his gaze, only the intense attention of a man who suddenly realized that he had witnessed something truly rare. He even decided to record the fight, his fingers trembling as he reached for the settings. My intuition told me that if Sojun could really beat her, the video would be just right, one that would blow up all the ratings and go down in history. Shin Hyam raised her then over her head, and she struck Sojun with her sword, but he managed to block it. Steel met steel with a deafening clang, and for a split second, time stood still, emphasizing the importance of this moment. The next blow was Sojun's. He didn't hesitate. He didn't wait. His blade rushed forward with such speed that it seemed like a blur, flying in defiance of fate. It was a very fierce battle. Neither of the opponents was going to give in an inch, and every movement was imbued with a thirst for victory, which became for them not just a goal, but a matter of honor. But Sojun expected this from Shin Hyam. He knew her style, remembered her tactics, and in this knowledge lay his strength. He did not fight blindly. He went into battle with his eyes open, ready for any turn of events. He had felt it before, this rhythm, this unstoppable energy that made her move faster than normal human capabilities allowed. And that was what made her so dangerous. But she was more talented than anyone he had met in his past life. The thought crossed his mind, not as an admission of defeat, but as a tribute to an opponent who deserved to stand in the same arena with him. Of course, apart from himself, this quiet confidence was not bragging, but rather an internal compass that never lied and always pointed to his true place in this world. Kim screamed, not understanding what he was doing at the last moment. His voice broke into a hoarse cry, full of bewilderment and fear, because Sojun's actions went against all the laws of logic and self-preservation. And suddenly, Shin Hyam delivered her decisive blow and impaled Sojun on her sword. The scene was so flawless and brutal that for a moment it seemed as if the outcome of the fight had already been decided and there was no point in arguing with it. Kim sighed because he hadn't expected anything else. This heavy exhalation was filled with the bitterness of defeat, which he had already mentally accepted, and this made it especially bitter. But that wasn't the end. There was a tension in the silence that followed the blow, as if reality itself had frozen, waiting for what would happen next, and that pause was louder than any scream. Sojun pulled the weapon out of himself with his bare hand. The movement was sharp, almost careless, and there was not a drop of pain in it, only a cold determination to continue the fight to the very end. And with a clang, he threw it to the floor, the metal hitting the stone with a deafening sound that sounded like a challenge to fate itself, and the sound echoed throughout the arena. Sojun wasn't in any pain, and there was no blood. The virtual reality carefully smoothed out all the physical consequences, leaving only the essence. The struggle, the tension, and the emotions that were real, despite the artificiality of the world. Virtual reality worked wonders. It allowed us to break the laws of physics, experience the impossible, and go beyond human capabilities. And this was precisely its main magic. And then Kim realized that his neighbor had deliberately set himself up for the attack, and the revelation struck his mind like lightning, and all of Sojun's absurd actions suddenly came together to form a single, frighteningly brilliant strategy. It turned out that he was simply curious. Behind that simple word lay a thirst for knowledge, a desire to understand how far the enemy could go before revealing his true intentions. At that moment, the sword began to appear in Shin Hyam's hand again. It materialized from the flickering light, perfect and deadly. And this meant that the game was not over yet, but had only moved on to a new level. She was ready to attack, her posture even more collected, her gaze even sharper, and now it contained not only determination, but also a new, cold rage caused by the fact that her perfect strike had not brought victory. And at that very second she rushed at Sojun, she moved with such speed that she seemed not a person but an embodied element, indomitable and merciless. Shin Hyam flew towards him like a bullet, her silhouette blurred in a swift dash. And in that moment she became the embodiment of pure attack, leaving no room for doubt or error. Sojun was also determined to win. There was no fear or hesitation in his eyes, only absolute concentration and a readiness to meet danger head-on, without retreating an inch. Their blades met in a furious attack, sparks flying everywhere, each blow creating new flashes, turning the arena into a blazing whirlwind where steel sang its own song. Sojun's gaze was fixed forward. He was not distracted by anything unnecessary. He did not look for excuses and did not think about the consequences. His world narrowed to one point: the enemy in front of him. Shin Hyam didn't expect such an onslaught from him. Her confidence cracked for the first time, and this tiny crack became the very weak spot that Sojun couldn't miss. She hesitated for a moment, just a split second, but in a world where speed was everything, it felt like an eternity. And her opponent took advantage of this moment, his blade rushing forward like a bird of prey. And this blow was so precise and powerful that it seemed as if fate itself was guiding his hand. Shin Hyam took a powerful blow. Her defense crumbled like a house of cards, and she suddenly felt the ground slipping out from under her feet, her confidence melting like ice under the scorching sun. Sojun decided to kick her. He didn't limit himself to any limits, using everything that could bring victory, and this unexpected maneuver caught her off guard. It was so powerful that it dealt serious damage to Shin Hyam. The damage numbers flashed on the screen, confirming the destructive power of the blow. And even the spectators held their breath for a moment, not believing their eyes. She sat motionless on the floor, and Sojun decided that she was not going to attack further. In this short pause, he tried to grasp her intentions, to understand whether she was broken or simply waiting for the right moment to counterattack. And then he decided to attack himself, not to wait for her to recover, not to give her a second of respite, because in this battle, mercy was tantamount to defeat. He flew towards her like an arrow, and he struck with his sword. But Shin Hyam managed to repel the attack. Her reaction was lightning fast, and this reflected her whole essence. She did not give up even when defeat seemed inevitable. Two swords clashed in battle, steel crashing into steel, scattering sparks, and filling the air with a sharp ringing that sounded like the anthem of this endless battle. But suddenly one of them cracked with a crunch. The sound was so unexpected and piercing that for a moment it drowned out even the noise of the crowd, and all eyes turned to the place where the legend was broken. This picture left Kim in amazement. He froze, unable to tear his eyes away from the screen, and his mind could not comprehend how such a thing could have happened. Shin Hyam's sword shattered into sharp pieces, scattering in all directions, sparkling in the arena light, and that moment symbolized the collapse of her invincible image. Shin Hyam was thrown back by the sword's crushing blow as if struck by a storm wave, her body flying several meters before collapsing to the ground, and there was something almost tragic about that helplessness. There was a hint of anticipation in Sojun's eyes, but there was no malice in them, only the cold satisfaction of a man who had proven to himself and the world that he was worthy of standing at the top. His opponent fell heavily to the ground, dropping the weapon from her weakened fingers. This gesture was more eloquent than any words, an admission that the battle was lost, and now all that remained was to come to terms with this fact. Sojun finally told her that if she devoted another 80 years to training, she might be able to defeat him. There was no cruelty in these words, only a touch of irony, seasoned with respect for an opponent who fought to the last. And the next blow of his sword landed right on his opponent's neck, proving fatal. The light flashed, the system recorded the victory, and the entire arena froze for a moment, realizing that it had just witnessed a historic event. Sojun had emerged victorious in this duel, a title he had not sought but which was now rightfully his, and the weight of that victory was felt in his every move. Kim stared at him, his mouth hanging open, watching the notification that the 10th difficulty level prototype had changed, the lines flashing on the screen, confirming that the rules of the game had just changed, and now everything would be different. Looking at his neighbor, Sojun sarcastically asked if these skills were enough to start streaming, a question that wasn't mocking, but rather a challenge, an invitation to acknowledge the obvious. He was ready for the next step. The next day, everything in their room was different. The atmosphere had changed, as if the room itself sensed that now living here was not just a player, but a potential star, ready to conquer new heights. Kim Tae-woo, who had lost the deal, was busy on all fronts, rushing around the room, collecting things, setting up equipment, and in his every movement one could read resignation to the inevitable, and, at the same time, the desire to do everything perfectly. And Sojun just gave him instructions, calmly, without unnecessary fuss, like a man who knows exactly what he wants and has no doubt that everything will work out. Kim promised himself that he would never argue with this man again, a decision dictated not by resentment but by respect that could not be ignored after what he had seen. A new game was installed yesterday, so it was time for Sojun to start. The time for reflection was over, and now a new battle awaited him. This time not with a bot or a champion, but with millions of viewers. He had to register and prepare everything for the stream. Every detail mattered, from the lighting to the camera angle, and even the slightest mistake could cost him his first viewers. He sat down in the game capsule and closed his eyes, a familiar gesture that now felt like a step into the unknown, and there was something exciting and slightly terrifying in that pre-launch silence. A bright flash flashed before him. The world around him dissolved in blinding light, and for a moment he lost touch with reality, feeling suspended between two worlds. And the virtual world transported him to a new location. Space formed around him with frightening speed, and he suddenly found himself in a place that was simultaneously familiar and completely alien. Sojun tried to figure out where he was now. He slowly turned his head, absorbing every detail, trying to get his bearings in this new environment that was supposed to be his stage. The system window told him that he was in a game lobby and he needed to prepare thoroughly before starting the game. Lines of text flashed before his eyes, reminding him that even the greatest battles begin with simple steps. He clearly remembered that streamers communicated with viewers from their personal lobbies, and now it became clear where they tuned in, and this thought brought with it a feeling of confidence, because he finally began to understand the rules of this new game. Sojun even decided to decorate it later. In his mind, he was already arranging decorative elements, thinking through the details that would make his lobby recognizable and cozy, because spectators came not only for the gameplay, but also for the atmosphere. Although for now, it was all just a dream. But first, he decided to launch a stream on travel. This platform was a benchmark, a place where legends were born, and starting here meant immediately establishing himself at the highest level. It was the #1 system platform in the world, its logo glowing in the corner of the screen, a reminder of the scale of what was happening, and the realization made my insides clench with excitement and anticipation. From now on, Sojun had one goal: to gain a reputation as a streamer, to participate in the league. This goal became his compass, guiding his every action, and he was willing to work tirelessly for it. His first broadcast was about to begin, the timer counting down the final seconds, and with each tick, the tension grew, mixing with the excitement that pushed him forward. The game he chose was called Dawn of the Assassin Squad, Shadows in the City, a title both mysterious and promising not just battles, but a whole story the viewer would be immersed in. It was a medieval assassin game where the player eliminated targets using stealth techniques, and it valued grace, calculation, and the ability to remain invisible until the perfect moment to strike rather than brute force. On its premiere day, the game attracted 2 million viewers, and even a week later, its popularity hadn't waned. This figure inspired respect and was simultaneously frightening, reminding him that he would be playing not just for himself, but in front of a huge audience that forgave nothing. It was perfect for aspiring streamers, with plenty of action but still allowing for some individuality, which is why Sojun chose it. Under cover of night, the grappling hook flew towards the fortress wall. The metal hook described an arc in the dark sky, and with a dull clang dug into the stone, securing the path upward. and it hooked its metal hook onto the edge of the brickwork, a strong grip that had to withstand the weight and speed, and the success of the entire operation depended on the reliability of this part. The man in the dark cloak, hiding his face under the hood, rushed forward like an arrow, holding the second end of the rope in his hands. His movements were silent and precise, as if he himself had become part of the night shadow. His tenacious hands gripped the edge of the wall, his fingers digging into the stone, and he paused for a second, testing the strength of his support before making the decisive leap. Another moment, and he was already on the wall of the fortress. The heights had submitted to him, and now a new horizon, full of dangers and opportunities, opened up before him. He quickly looked around him. This is how Sojun's first broadcast began. Kim Tae-woo helped him choose the name for the stream, which sounded like, "This is my first time streaming, a total noob. So, who wants some advice?" This deliberate self-irony contained a clever hook, and Sojun wondered if this desperate move, capable of hooking viewers from the very first second, would work. Sojun wondered if it would work, that same anticipation stirring in his chest when you throw a coin into a well and freeze, listening to the sound of it falling, not knowing if it will bring good luck. Kim took on the role of his mentor in this matter and promised to bring a crowd of people. His words did not sound like empty bravado, but rather the confidence of a man who knew how to promote even the most modest start. And this support gave Sojun courage. But this wasn't Sojun's first time playing games. He had years of experience behind him, hundreds of completed missions and battles that no one knew about. And now he looked at all of this, not with the eyes of a newbie, but with the gaze of a veteran who had simply changed the battlefield. He looked down appreciatively at this beautiful location. The stone of the fortress walls shimmered in the moonlight, the shadows fell perfectly, and every pixel breathed life, making him forget about the goal for a moment and simply admire this digital masterpiece. The graphics were top-notch, not just pleasing to the eye, but drawing you in, blurring the lines between the game and reality. And Sojun found himself thinking that he would be ready to simply wander through this world, absorbing every detail. He needed to enjoy such things. This simple truth suddenly seemed incredibly important to him because in the endless race for victories, it was so easy to forget why you took up a sword in the first place. Suddenly, someone called him, calling him Danny. The voice sounded very close, soft but insistent, and for a second he was confused, forgetting that he was no longer Sojun but a different person living by different rules. Turning around, he saw the girl Christina, who warned him that he could die on this mission. There was genuine concern in her eyes, and this concern, even if programmed, touched him in a strange way. He answered her that it had never been different. There was no bravado in these words, only a calm statement of the fact to which he had long been accustomed. Risk was an integral part of his path, and without it, everything lost its meaning. Sojun realized that the training and dialogue here were automatic. He mentally chuckled, realizing that these touching warnings were just a script, but even in this artificiality, there was something cozy, like in the good old tutorials that taught you not to give up. His voice sounded different than it did in reality. He was now in the character named Danny, and this alien timbre, slightly muffled and more melodic, made him feel for a moment like someone else, free from the burden of the past. Christina wanted to answer him something. Her lips moved as if she was choosing words that could reach his stubborn heart, but he didn't give her a chance. But Danny was quick to say that if you want to kill someone, be prepared to die yourself. This phrase sounded like a motto carved on the blade of his sword, and it contained his entire philosophy of life. You have no right to demand someone else's life if you are not ready to give your own. He was right, but she still asked him to be careful because they could be expected. This warning sounded not only concern, but also knowledge of the area, and Sojun thought for a second whether he should ignore this advice. Danny told her not to worry and to step into the tavern. Christina held out a folded piece of paper, her fingers lingering for a moment as she handed over the fragile object, and there was more to the gesture than just the passing of a quest. And once again, she reminded him that no one could be trusted. Her voice became quieter, almost a whisper, and these words sounded like the most important instruction that he had to remember, even if everything else was erased from his memory. Sojun realized that it all started with this little piece of paper, with this phrase, "From this moment when virtual reality stopped being just a game and became an arena for his new battle." And then Danny said that even chaos cannot be trusted. This thought flashed in his mind like a bright spark, and he suddenly felt that these words could become his new motto, suitable for this crazy path. And the boarding cat again dug its claws into the edge of the wall, the metallic clang sounding like a signal to begin. And this sound echoed in Sojun's chest with a familiar adrenaline rush. His hand gripped the end of the rope tightly, his fingers digging into the rough fabric, and he felt the tension flow from his muscles into the steel, making him one with this moment. Dennis moved deftly from one point to another. He moved with the grace of a predator, using every ledge, every crack in the wall to get closer to his target, and it was not just movement, but a dance with death. He even used city lights as support, a risky maneuver that could have cost him his life. But it was in such crazy decisions that true mastery was born, capable of surprising even the most sophisticated spectators. Danny landed safely on the new roof. The landing was soft, almost silent, and for a split second he froze, enjoying this perfect moment when everything turns out exactly as you planned. But suddenly, a system window appeared before his eyes. A bright rectangle flashed, breaking the atmosphere, and the reality of the game rudely reminded him of itself, returning him to the dry instructions and rules. The game announced that the automatic part of the tutorial had come to an end. The lines of text flashed and disappeared, leaving him alone in this world, where now every decision would have to be made independently. Sojun began to look at what would happen if he followed the chosen path. He froze on the edge of the roof, peering into the dark streets, and in this pause, one could feel the tension of a hunter, choosing where to take the next step. But the passage was closed. A wall blocked the way as if mocking his plans, and for a moment he felt the annoyance that is common to any player faced with an unexpected obstacle. The system gave a hint to climb the pipes, a short message devoid of emotion, but it contained the key to progress. And Sojun quickly assessed the route, estimating how difficult it would be. He looked again at how he should grab onto something and climb up, his gaze sliding over the rusty pipes, assessing the reliability of each support, and at that moment he again felt like that same Sojun who was used to relying only on his own strength. Sojun's hand grabbed the first pipe. The metal was cold and rough, and this feeling of reality, albeit virtual, gave him confidence. And he, like a mountain climber, covered this path with lightning speed. His movements were honed, almost instinctive, and he climbed up with such ease as if he had been doing nothing else his whole life. Another second, and he found himself on the roof. The wind hit his face, revealing a view of the entire city, and for a moment he forgot that it was just a game. This world seemed so alive and real. Sojun was shocked because his body moved on its own. He didn't think about every move, didn't calculate his steps, but simply acted, and this complete immersion felt like a miracle, erasing the boundaries between the player and the character. The immersion in the game was amazing. It wasn't just captivating, it was completely absorbing, making you forget about everything except the current moment, and Sojun understood why people were willing to spend days on end here. Now it was necessary to complete a training mission and eliminate Etteri, a high-ranking aristocrat and mid-level manager in a secret society. The assassin squad had entrusted this mission to Danny. It wasn't just a task, it was a sign of trust, and he wasn't going to let down those who believed in him, even if they were just bots. The map even showed the path to the victim, a convenient detail that could either help or become a trap, since too easy a path often led into a trap. A very convenient game. This thought flashed with a hint of irony, because the convenience in this game was often deceptive. And behind every pleasant bonus, there was a price. The system suggested using a rope for descent, another simple option, which Sojun suspected also had a catch, and he was already preparing for the unexpected. But then, Curiosity kicked in, and he decided to see what would happen if he let go of the rope halfway. This impulse was purely exploratory, that same spirit of adventure that often led to the most unexpected discoveries. After all, he could use a typical Korean feint and jump down from the middle of the rope. In his head, he was already formulating the perfect trick that should look impressive and stylish, and he wanted to see if the game would allow him to pull it off. And Danny unclenched his hands and let go of the rope, the moment of weightlessness, when the world freezes and you hang between heaven and earth, was both frightening and intoxicating. He plummeted like a bullet, his speed increasing with each passing second, and the wind whistled in his ears, drowning out all other sounds, turning the fall into a wild, uncontrollable flight. The landing wasn't the softest. Apparently, that wasn't how it worked. The impact with the ground reverberated throughout his body, and the illusion of lightness instantly dissipated, reminding him that physics in the game did have its own laws. But when Sojun glanced at the screen, he saw the first comments, lines of text flashing in the corner, and that simple fact made something inside him skip a beat. Someone was actually watching him. And then he remembered that he was streaming, and his first viewers were already starting to make fun of him. Their words weren't mean, but friendly, and they conveyed that very lively communication for which it all had been started. It turned out that 4 people were watching, though Sojun had expected 0. This small victory, so unnoticed by others, was a true revelation for him, proof that he was on the right path. Apparently, the title really did help. The thought brought a slight smile, and he silently thanked Kim for this simple yet brilliant idea. And then he saw the nicknames of those who were in the chat: Disabled Man on a White Horse, Winter Yellowtail Simple, and King of Brickwork. They sounded absurd and funny, and this strange combination had its own charm, its own special humor, understandable only to its own kind. It was quite funny, and Sojun realized that this was some kind of trend. He chuckled, realizing that he had found himself in the very atmosphere where irony and self-irony were the main language of communication, and this made everything even more interesting. But then he remembered that Kim Tae-woo had given him advice, and his friend's words came back to him like a beacon in the darkness, reminding him that the most important thing now was not to get confused and not to lose that fragile connection with the audience. He said that at first you need to try to somehow break up the pauses. This simple recommendation suddenly took on a new meaning, and Sojun realized that silence was the enemy here, and the word was the best weapon. Even if there were very few or no audience, there was no need to obsess over numbers, Kim repeated with the insistence of a teacher. And now Sojun saw how true this advice was. The numbers came and went, but the connection remained. After all, the most important thing here was interaction. The reason people came to him, not the top streamers, was because of the communication. This idea became the foundation of his new strategy, and he suddenly felt less like a lone player and more like part of something bigger. While the chat on big streams was so intense that some players' messages got lost, this simple truth was the basis of a whole philosophy. Here, in a small cozy chat, every voice mattered, and that's what made his stream special. To begin with, Sojun decided to chat a little. He took a deep breath, collecting his thoughts, and decided that the first step should be simple and sincere. He began to respond to all their comments, and the viewers reminded him that it was time to start the quest. Their encouragement sounded not like a reproach, but like a friendly push, and this made it easier to move forward. Danny found himself in Count Etery's estate, the dark walls looming over him, and the silence around him seemed ominous, as if the building itself knew his intentions and was preparing to fight back. He got there quite quickly. This rapid dash was the result of not only skill, but also luck, and Sojun mentally noted that luck was also part of skill. He wanted to simply break in, but the viewers advised him to look at Christina's note. Their voices merged into a single chorus, and he suddenly realized that these strangers in the chat had become his temporary team, his guides in this unfamiliar world. Danny did just that. He took out the piece of paper, unfolded it, and read the uneven lines, feeling how these simple words made his chest go cold. Etteri himself, according to the map, was in a bedroom on the second floor, and the note mentioned 20 potential enemies. The numbers hit him in the mind, reminding him that an easy walk was turning into a serious test, where one mistake could cost him everything. Sojun decided to take a look at the weapons available to his hero. He opened his inventory, and his gaze slid over the meager set that was supposed to be his only chance at victory. They were a stiletto and an iron gauntlet, simple, unassuming objects devoid of the prestige of legendary weapons. But their reliability and functionality held a certain power. A set of standard tutorial weapons. The thought passed through his mind with a hint of irony, but he quickly dismissed it. It wasn't the weapon that made a warrior great, but the one who wielded it. But to simply kill Etteri, it was enough. He weighed the stiletto in his hand, feeling its balance, and realized that sometimes the simplest solution was the most effective. Sojun was about to send his hero on a mission, but the viewers stopped him. Their comments flashed on the screen, and he froze, realizing that these people saw something that he had not yet noticed. Some wrote to him so that he would at least read the note to the end, while others decided not to interfere with him learning to die. This contradiction was the whole beauty of streaming. Some wanted to help, others just wanted to enjoy the spectacle, and he had to find a balance between them. Sojun wasn't quite sure what was going on. He frowned as he reread the note and suddenly noticed a line he'd missed the first time, and the discovery made his fingers go cold. It turned out that he couldn't just go through the main gate. That obvious route was a trap designed for newbies, and now he felt stupid for almost falling into it. And when the audience asked if he knew how to use a fighter's style when he was able to outplay the enemy's numerical advantage, the question sounded not like a mockery, but like a test, and Sojun suddenly realized that his experience could play a decisive role here. One of the viewers suggested that in this game, if he was caught on a mission, the bots would become much stronger, so they usually looked for a workaround. This information was like a sip of cold water clearing his mind, and he instantly revised all his plans. But very rarely did veteran players go straight through the gates, killing everyone in the open. The thought of such a crazy option made a slight smile touch his lips. It had its own charm, its own audacity, which always attracted him. And no one had ever managed to complete the assassin-style training. This statistic sounded like a challenge, and something inside him stirred. He loved being the one who broke the rules and set records. It seemed that even the hardcore players in the community hadn't yet mastered it, and this realization gave him courage because it meant he was facing a task worthy of a true master. But there was a chance, if he had control like Shin Hayam, that he really had a chance to do the impossible. Hearing this, Sojun decided to try this option. The decision came instantly, like a flash, and he no longer hesitated. He would go straight ahead because that was how he always won. The castle looked like something out of a horror movie, its gloomy towers reaching towards the sky like clawed fingers, the lights flashing ominously and the crows circling, adding even more hopelessness and gloom to the picture. The pressure was intense, weighing down on his shoulders like lead, and Sojun froze for a second, feeling the reality of the game closing in around him, leaving no room for error. Sojun decided to take another look at the chat. Lines flashed before his eyes, and he tried to snatch from this stream at least a grain of useful information that could keep him afloat. They said that underestimating a streamer is also a kind of entertainment for viewers. But these words contained the bitter truth of a community where the downfall of others sometimes became the main attraction. But these guys had gotten too carried away. Their taunts no longer seemed harmless, but hit the target, and Sojun gritted his teeth, not allowing himself to succumb to this poison. He'd already managed to attract 3 new viewers, so the bite had been a success. This small victory eased the bitterness a bit, reminding him that his risky strategy was working. But as long as these viewers didn't cross the line, everything was fine. He'd mentally drawn this invisible line beyond which real aggression began, and as long as they didn't cross it, he could live with it. Danny's footsteps were immediately heard by the knights. Metal clanged, armor creaked, and the silence of the courtyard exploded with alarm, as if someone had plucked an invisible string. And a second later they saw him. Their gazes crossed on the lonely figure, and in that moment the inevitability of the coming battle was frozen. Viewers immediately began writing that he had been caught, their messages flashing one after another like flashes of lightning, and each comment was a small jab spurring him on to action. But Sojun said that he only came to watch. This phrase sounded with such equanimity that for a second even the knights froze, as if doubting the reality of what was happening. The audience continued to laugh at him, their laughter echoing throughout the chat, and Sojun felt a fire blazing inside him that couldn't stand the mockery. One of the knights swung his sword at him and shouted for him to quickly identify himself. His voice was rough and commanding, but there was already a shadow of doubt in it, as if instinct told him that this was no ordinary stranger. But Sojun was able to deftly parry the blow, holding his sword out. Steel met steel with a deafening clang, and this sound became the signal for the beginning of the real battle. And with the next movement, he dealt the knight a powerful blow. The movement was so swift and precise that it seemed as if time slowed down for a second, emphasizing the beauty of this deadly maneuver. He fell to the ground and was unable to rise, his body collapsing with a heavy thud, and for a moment there was silence, broken only by the echo of the blow. After this, a debate began in the comments about whether this player was truly a newbie or just lucky. Voices were divided, and the chat turned into a battlefield of opinions where everyone defended their version. But Sojun himself didn't immediately understand what had happened. He froze for a second, staring at the motionless body, and his mind couldn't comprehend how it all ended so quickly. And why did the enemy die so quickly? This question throbbed in his temples, and he felt not like a winner, but like a participant in some strange trick where the rules were changing right before his eyes. Suddenly, another knight appeared from behind, a dark figure emerging from the semi-darkness, and cold metal was already flying towards his throat, promising instant retribution for his arrogance. But even here, Sojun didn't miss the blow, his blade darting back with instinctive precision. And this maneuver once again proved that his body knew more than his mind. Viewers began writing that it was time for him to buy a lottery ticket. Their jokes now sounded less offensive and more like an acknowledgement that something unusual was happening here. The second knight also fell unconscious after the first blow. Another body joined the first, and the picture became more and more surreal. Everyone started discussing the players' two parries in a row. The term came up in the chat, and Sojun heard the word for the first time, which suddenly became the key to understanding what was happening. But Sojun didn't quite understand what was going on. He frowned, trying to connect his actions with this new term, and felt as if he was speaking a foreign language. Viewers began to write that he was really cool if he did this without even knowing what a parry was. Their words sounded like genuine admiration mixed with bewilderment, and this recognition was more pleasant than any praise. Sojun asked them to stop bickering and just explain it to him, his voice on the broadcast sounding firm, and the chat went silent for a second, listening to the man who seemed to be doing the impossible. It turned out that if he timed his block perfectly, the opponent would be dumbfounded. This simple formula concealed a whole science within itself, and now he saw how his intuitive movements took on meaning. From the comments, it became clear that even the pros had difficulty with this, and this thought made him straighten up because it confirmed that he was doing something that only a few people could manage. Kim Tae-woo mentioned that the level 9 bots were almost at the level of professionals, and remembering his friend's words gave this victory even more weight, turning it from an accident into a pattern. Judging by their skills, the so-called pros were no match for Sojun. This daring thought crossed his mind, and for the first time he allowed himself to believe in his own superiority. It turned out that this was truly a difficult task, since in order to parry he had to clearly anticipate the enemy's attack and react with his body in time. Now he understood that behind his every move there was not luck, but precise calculation honed by years of training. Now Sojun understood what parry was. The word took on flesh and blood, and he mentally added it to his arsenal like another weapon in the endless battle. The audience wrote to him asking him to stop acting up. Their tone changed from mocking to demanding, and they were no longer expecting mistakes from him, but a demonstration of skill. They had written in the chat before that his self-confidence was irritating, and it was all pure luck. Those old messages now seemed distant and insignificant to him, like shadows melting with the dawn. But suddenly a comment appeared that these did not look like the lucky guy's movements. They were too unusual. One phrase said in his defense broke through the general noise, and for a second he felt grateful to this stranger. But as soon as this man supported Sojun, he immediately became the target of ridicule. A wave of aggression instantly spread to him, and Sojun bitterly recognized this old, familiar pattern. He had encountered this before in his past life. Images of the past flashed in his memory, and he again felt like that same boy who was rejected just for who he was. Due to his lowly origin and lack of faction affiliation, even when defeating the disciples of the great sects, Sojun's skills were always looked down upon and criticized. Although now, of course, everything was different. Here he was judged not by his origin, but by the way he held the sword, and this freedom was more valuable than any title. Suddenly he saw movement next to him. A glint of metal caught in his peripheral vision, and instinct instantly put him on alert. Sojun was surrounded by several knights with swords at once, the ring tightening, and each blade was aimed at him, promising a swift and merciless reprisal. But the essence of the battle remained the same, no matter how many there were or what titles they held. The main thing was not to waver and not to retreat a single step. Whatever the reason, he wanted to prove them wrong. With the result, this goal became his shield and sword, and it gave him strength where anyone else would have broken. The knights attacked him from all sides, blows rained down, and the space around him turned into a whirlwind of steel, screams, and mortal danger. But Sojun noticed any attack, even from behind. His senses were heightened to the limit, and he saw the world not with his eyes but with his whole being, catching the slightest movement. And it wasn't particularly difficult for him to defeat them. Each parry became more and more confident, and the knights fell one after another like bowling pins before a hurricane. One blow followed another, and only one opponent remained in front of Sojun, the last barrier that was supposed to prove that this victory was not a fluke. The player swung his sword high above him, the movement filled with strength and determination, and the whole story of his struggle was written in it. The next blow dealt the knight a critical blow. The blade entered precisely at the vulnerable point, and resistance instantly ceased, and he fell to the ground dead. The silence that followed this blow was louder than any scream, and it announced his unconditional victory. If they wanted to catch Sojun, they would need at least 108 Shaolin Arhats. This daring thought flashed with slight irony, and he allowed himself a short smile worthy of a true master. Seeing his victories, the comments changed completely. The tone of the chat changed dramatically, and instead of ridicule, there were enthusiastic exclamations and attempts to unravel his secret. One of the knights was still able to move and decided to go for reinforcements. This last spark of resistance flared up and immediately died out, faced with his ruthless determination. But Sojun didn't let him do that. As if sensing his intentions, his sword slid towards him like lightning, fast and inevitable. The player breathed a sigh of relief. He didn't sing, a short phrase spoken with a tired smile, and in it one could hear not triumph, but simple human relief. Now that it was clear they were all gone, he slowly looked around, making sure the threat was over, and allowed himself to relax for a second. The result of this battle was -6 opponents, a dry statistic that could not convey the full intensity of the battle, but clearly recorded its outcome. A storm erupted in the chat. Everyone tried to figure out who this pro was playing under the guise of a noob. Theories multiplied, arguments raged, and his identity became the biggest mystery of the day. Sojun even had to ban one of them, a harsh decision made without hesitation because he wasn't about to let chaos ruin the fragile magic of this moment. But many believed that with such talent, this player would soon break all records and those banned would deeply regret it. And with such an introduction, there was no need to worry about the future. These words of support warmed the heart, reminding everyone that amidst the noise, there will always be those who see the essence. In his past life, Sojun had tried to blend in because of his roots, and he remembered the constant tension of having every move scrutinized and any show of force that could lead to disaster. The major sects kept a close eye on him, and he couldn't fit in anywhere. This feeling of being an eternal outsider still echoed within him like a quiet reminder of the price he had paid for his path. But it was impossible to hide his talent, so Sojun inevitably became famous as a sword god. A fame that came not by his own will, but as an inevitable consequence of his strength, and he learned to live with it, accepting both its light and its shadow. But the memories of the master reminded them of how hard it had been for them because of his quirks. The teacher's tired face appeared before their eyes, and this made them feel bitter because the price of success was measured not only by victories, but also by the suffering of others. In the chat, everyone was trying to figure out why this player was so good at parrying, because he had a godlike control. They were looking for an explanation in the mechanics of the game, in hidden abilities, not realizing that behind it was a whole life lived on the edge of a blade. But Sojun simply called it a gimmick from his past life. He tried to reduce it to a simple joke so as not to reveal to everyone that part of himself that he kept secret. In response to these words, there was a deathly silence. The chat froze, and this silence was louder than any words, because no one knew how to react to such a blatant omission. And he had to say that it was most likely because he was watching carefully and swinging his sword at the right time. A simple, almost banal phrase that was supposed to calm the audience and return everything to normal. But the audience didn't like this answer. They felt that there was something more hidden behind this simplicity, and they weren't going to let go of this mystery so easily. Suddenly, Sojun saw a crowd already rushing towards him. The ranks of knights were rolling in like a dark wave, and their numbers inspired respect even in such an experienced fighter. The knights surrounded the stranger from all sides. A wall of steel and fury closed around him, and it seemed that this time even his skill would not be enough. Messages appeared in the chat asking him to finally die and finish this training because he would never be able to defeat Etteri anyway. These words conveyed the weariness of the viewers who wanted to see the ending, no matter what it was. But the noob decided to show them what 13 parries in a row looked like. This bold phrase was a challenge not only to the knights, but to the entire chat. And he was ready to prove that his nickname was just a mask hiding the true master. There was only one enemy, so there was nothing to fear. In this calm awareness lay the confidence of a master who knew that one enemy was not a threat, but simply another problem that needed to be solved. Sojun glanced around sharply. His gaze slid across the space, capturing every detail, and in a split second he had a complete picture of his surroundings, not missing a single movement. He accurately assessed the location of his enemies. His brain instantly prioritized, selecting targets according to the degree of threat. And now he saw not a chaotic crowd, but a clearly structured sequence of actions. They ran quickly towards him from all sides, the ranks of knights closing in like steel waves rolling onto a lonely cliff, and in their rapid movement one could sense a ruthless force. Sojun was ready to strike them at any moment, his body frozen in a perfect stance, ready to break into an attack at the slightest signal, and this composure made him not just a fighter, but the embodiment of deadly grace. Commenters began writing that this player probably had eyes in the back of his head. Viewers couldn't hide their amazement, trying to find a logical explanation for how he managed to see everything around him without turning his head. The knights tried to harm him, their blades cutting through the air, leaving silvery trails behind them, and each blow carried the promise of pain and defeat. But he easily parried every attack, his sword moving with such effortless precision that it seemed an extension of his will, parrying blows with a grace that bordered on the miraculous. The steel of the swords struck sparks that flew everywhere. Fiery flashes lit up the stage, turning the battle into a blazing dance, where every reflection emphasized the beauty and lethality of what was happening. The knights' heads flew one after another. This merciless rhythm left no doubt about the outcome of the battle, and the ranks of the enemy melted away with frightening speed. This player could not lose. His every move was filled with unshakable confidence, and fate itself seemed to bow before his determination. His incomparable fight was ready to pull anyone out of their computer chair. Even the most indifferent viewer would not be able to remain calm watching this whirlwind of steel and speed. Now it was completely impossible to believe that this was a noob. The nickname, given as a joke, now sounded like a mockery of reality, and everyone saw before them not a newbie, but a real virtuoso. He couldn't leave even the most ardent fans of this game indifferent. His style attracted attention, forcing them to hold their breath and follow every maneuver, afraid to miss even a moment of this masterpiece. This game emphasized stealth and silent assassination. The developers thought through every detail, creating a world where shadow and silence were essential allies, and any show of force could prove fatal. The developers assured that anyone attempting to demonstrate masterful gameplay would pay a heavy price, a hidden threat of a system ready to punish overconfidence. As soon as the team announced their principles, one player named Joam, who cared about gameplay more than anything else, was delighted. For him, these rules became not a restriction but a challenge, the promise of a true test of his skill. However, due to the increased difficulty, many players' efforts were dashed by the despair system. The game's merciless mechanics were unforgiving of mistakes, and even experienced fighters often found themselves defeated before they could reach their full potential. Kills could be achieved by dropping turrets on players' heads. Cunning tactics and unconventional solutions were sometimes the only chance for victory, and players resorted to any tricks to overcome the system. But once you figured out the target's behavior pattern, everything became simpler. You could plant explosives, and presto, this simple solution contained the entire philosophy of the game. Knowledge was stronger than strength, and patience was more powerful than anger. But the target could be awaited for hours, and these long minutes of waiting tested not only skills, but also nerves, turning the hunt into an exhausting game of hide-and-seek. Well, even after watching streamers of all stripes, Joam couldn't find the perfect game. He was looking for that benchmark where strategy, tactics, and skill merged into a single whole, and not a single stream he saw could satisfy this thirst for perfection. But now everything had changed. He saw the masterful gameplay he had been waiting for, and before him unfolded exactly what he had dreamed of. Flawless control, an intuitive understanding of the mechanics, and an audacity that defied the system itself. He found it on some unknown random streamer. This random find became a revelation for him, and he suddenly realized that true mastery is not always hidden behind big names. The game he had been so desperately waiting for was now before him, alive and real, and it embodied all his ideas about ideal gameplay. Viewers were already writing that he was simply the greatest player in Dawn, who could foresee very far ahead. Their words merged into a single chorus of admiration, and each comment was a recognition of his unique talent. Sojun was inundated with enthusiastic comments. The flow of messages never stopped, and he felt this wave of support, although he didn't fully understand how he had earned such attention. But he honestly couldn't understand what surprised them so much. For him, these were simply habitual movements, honed over years of training, and he didn't see anything supernatural in them. But when the comments started to get chaotic, Sojun decided to turn off the stream. The noise of voices was making it difficult to concentrate, and he needed a few moments of silence to collect his thoughts and get back into the rhythm of the fight. He was watched by 6 people who immediately became his subscribers. This small but meaningful gesture showed that his game found a response, and these people wanted to be witnesses to his every move. The stream resumed at the most interesting point. The picture came to life again, and viewers returned to the screen, ready to follow the next act of this gripping drama. As the boss battle began, the atmosphere instantly grew tense, and even the air seemed to become heavier, foreshadowing the clash of titans. He tried to hit Sojun with a huge mace, but he was able to dodge it. His instant reaction saved him from a crushing blow, and he slid to the side, avoiding certain death. Not all viewers were confident that he could handle this big guy. Doubts were floating in the chat, and some were already mentally saying goodbye to hope for victory, considering the boss invincible. But Sojun, without thinking, rushed into the attack. He did not wait for the enemy to strike the first blow, but dictated the terms of the battle himself, turning defense into offense. He began to strike first, every movement filled with determination, and his blade rushed forward, leaving the boss no time to breathe. And each new blow slowly dealt damage to the boss. Numbers flashed on the screen, confirming that his tactics were working, but the progress was so slow that it seemed almost imperceptible. But this wasn't enough. The tiny percentages of damage couldn't hide the harsh truth. At this rate, he would never defeat the enemy. Sojun realized that he was facing a serious opponent, and this realization did not break him, but only forced him to look for new paths and new opportunities that could turn the tide of the battle. He decided to ask the audience if it was also possible to parry a mace, at which point he put aside his pride and asked for help, realizing that in this fight, every hint could be decisive. But the boss was confident that his weapon would teach him a lesson. The giant figure loomed over Sojun, and the monster's eyes showed contempt for this impudent opponent. He began to strike again, the mace cutting through the air with a deafening whistle, and each swing threatened to wipe Sojun off the face of the earth. But Sojun also dodged them deftly, his body moving with incredible flexibility as he glided between the blows, as if dancing on the edge of life and death. For a moment, it seemed as if the mace was about to hit him. The tip whistled a millimeter from his shoulder, and the cold from the death that flew by made his heart stop for a second. The boss spun it with all his might to throw it towards the enemy. The giant weapon rose into the air, gaining monstrous speed, and this throw was supposed to be his last argument. Sojun jumped high into the air, landing above the boss, and he soared upward as if thrown by a spring, hanging in the air for a moment, becoming an elusive target. And he began to strike with his sword, his blade falling upon the enemy from above, and each blow was filled with all his fury and determination. But the mace didn't lag behind, and also tried to inflict damage. It continued to move by inertia, and its trajectory crossed space, threatening to hit him even in the air. But as Sojun thought, the damage didn't stack. The game mechanics worked exactly as he expected, and this knowledge gave him a small but important advantage. He even wondered if he could pass the level if he just kicked him around a little. The thought flashed through his mind with a hint of irony, but it concealed the desperation of a fighter searching for any chance of victory. The audience reminded him that not killing Ittori would be a failure of the mission, and their voices brought him back to reality, reminding him that the stakes were too high to allow himself to doubt. It turned out that the timer had been running all this time, and there were only 4 minutes left until the end. This number flashed in his mind like an alarm signal, and time suddenly became the most dangerous enemy. This distracted Sojun greatly, the thought of the ticking seconds making it difficult to concentrate, and he momentarily lost his rhythm, almost missing a beat. Ittori began to laugh and ask what he was looking at. His mocking laughter echoed throughout the arena, and in this sound, one could hear the triumph of an enemy confident of his victory. Sojun understood that if he continued in the same spirit, he would not be able to deal with the boss in this time. Cold calculation told him that his current tactics were doomed to failure, and he needed to change his strategy immediately. But the audience suggested that he needed to hit one spot, then the damage would increase. This simple but brilliant hint became a ray of light in the darkness for him, opening the way to victory. After thanking him, Sojun decided to take advantage of this hint. He cast aside all doubts and focused on a single goal, trusting the advice of those who believed in him. He began to hit Ittori in the same place, each blow landing precisely on target. And gradually, a gap began to appear in the boss's armor, indicating that the plan was working. It really turned out to be the right decision. The dynamics of the battle changed, and now the initiative was slowly but surely passing into his hands. These blows dealt significant damage to the boss, his health bar began to rapidly dwindle, and the hope of victory became not just a dream, but a real possibility. But time was short and he couldn't stop. Every second counted, and he had to make the most of the remaining moments. Sojun decided to launch the decisive attack. He gathered all his strength and concentration into one final spurt, ready to risk everything for victory. And he really hit the right spot. The blow was so powerful and precise that it seemed as if fate itself had guided his hand. Hitori began to shout at him to take his hands off his weapon, panic in his voice, an admission that the balance of power had finally shifted. He wanted to strike his opponent, but he missed, his huge hand cutting through the air without meeting resistance, and this clumsiness became a symbol of his impending defeat. There was just over a minute left, but Sojun continued to strike, not slowing down, not giving his enemy a second to recover, turning the last moments into a merciless attack. He struck the boss with incredible speed, his blade flashing before his eyes, merging into a solid silver spot, and each new blow brought the end closer. There was only one more blow left, this last line separating him from victory, and the tension reached its peak, causing his heart to beat at a frantic pace. All the spectators were waiting for the final blow. The chat froze in anticipation, and even the most caustic commentators fell silent, realizing that they were witnessing something truly great. Hitori did not want to give up, but he still lost. His figure wavered, and with the final blow, he fell to his knees, acknowledging the superiority of his opponent. The recording of this stream was truly spectacular, capturing every moment of this incredible battle, preserving it for history and for those who wanted to see how a legend is born. It was released under the title, "A Newbie Playing the Game for the First Time Takes Out 13 Tutorial Enemies on His First Try." A provocative title that captured the irony of the situation and instantly grabbed attention, promising something incredible. And it began to spread across all the streamers. The video gained views, comments, and reposts, and Sojun's name began to sound in every corner of the gaming community, announcing the emergence of a new star. In one of the windows of the houses, a light was burning brightly, a warm yellow glow breaking through the darkness like a lonely lighthouse in the raging sea of the night. And there was something almost homely hidden in it amidst all this confusion. His hand never left the mouse, his fingers digging into the plastic as if reality itself depended on it, and every movement was measured down to the millimeter, as if he held the very fate of the character in his fingertips. The game's fan was overjoyed to be able to capture the world's first playthrough. That cry of delight combined years of anticipation, sleepless nights, and the belief that the impossible is still possible. The video with Sojun spread across all chats. It rushed through the networks like a spark through dry grass, and each new repost fanned the flame of interest even more. Hitori screamed that before him stood a hypocritical dog of assassins, his voice bursting from the speakers, saturated with poison and impotent rage. And these words sounded like a curse thrown in the face of the winner. He was very angry. His anger was not just the resentment of a loser, but the collapse of all his plans, and this rage made him even more dangerous, even in the last moments. Then Sojun saw something. His gaze picked out a detail from the chaos of the battle that could not be ignored, and everything inside him tightened with a premonition of disaster. Symbols appeared around Hitori, strange runes glowed crimson, forming an ominous pattern, and the air around him thickened with magic, ready to burst forth. And then there was a deafening explosion, a roar that hit the ears, tearing apart space, and a bright flash blinded everything around for a second, erasing the boundaries between reality and the game. Sojun barely managed to dodge the shockwave. He darted to the side, feeling the heat scorching his skin, and only miraculously avoided being torn apart. That bastard Hitori used self-destruction magic, and this desperate tactic was not only anger but also pride, which did not allow him to give up without a final blow. On the other side, knights were already running towards Sojun, their heavy steps thundering on the stone, and the steel ranks were advancing inexorably, like fate itself, leaving no room for respite. But he was ready for this. There was no fear in his eyes, only the cold composure of a man who knows that a new chapter of the battle is about to begin. The moon in the sky was like a fireball. It hung low, huge, and ominous, filling everything around with an unnatural light in which the shadows seemed alive and predatory. Everyone tried to catch up with the assassin. The forest was already visible ahead, and Sojun wanted to hide in it. The dark silhouettes of the trees beckoned with their shadows, promising at least temporary protection from this madness. Suddenly he heard the whistle of an arrow flying toward him. The thin, piercing sound cut through the air, and time slowed for a second, giving him a chance to escape. Sojun managed to look back. His eyes caught the arrow's flight, and his brain instantly calculated the trajectory, but his body could no longer keep up with the thought. But he didn't have time to dodge. The tip pierced his shoulder, searing with pain, and this blow disrupted his rhythm, turning his confident movements into a desperate struggle for balance. His foot slipped off the edge of the abyss. The stone beneath his boot crunched treacherously, and the ground disappeared from under his feet, leaving him alone with the void. And he flew down the cliff, the wind whistling in his ears, and the world turned into a blur, and in those seconds there were no thoughts, no plans, only free fall. The knights could only look down, frozen on the edge, powerless and stunned, their figures appearing small and insignificant against the backdrop of the endless abyss. And Sojun just watched as they moved away, the altitude carrying him further and further, and the faces of his enemies became smaller and smaller until they turned into barely distinguishable dots. He fell with a crash into the turbulent river. The water met him with an icy blow, and the current instantly picked up his body, carrying him into its uncontrollable flow. Dawn was breaking in the mountains. The first rays of the sun were gently touching the peaks, painting them in pink tones, and this calm, almost gentle light was in sharp contrast to the storm that had just broken out. Sojun lay unconscious on the shore, his chest rising and falling slowly, looking like a tired traveler who had forgotten his way home, rather than a hero who had just survived a mortal battle. His hand was in cold water, thin streams sliding over his skin, and the touch was both calming and alarming, a reminder that the danger was not yet over. Suddenly, footsteps were heard nearby, quiet and cautious. They broke the morning silence, and every sound echoed in the air like the strike of a bell. A shadow loomed over the unconscious man, slowly descending to block out the light, and there was something both menacing and protective about the movement. The man in the black hood sat down next to him, his face in shadow, and this secrecy gave off a sense of mystery that he wanted to unravel at any cost. A golden eagle flashed in his hands, the metal gleamed in the first rays of the sun, and this symbol seemed not just a decoration, but a sign of fate that would change everything. There was a character change. In the comments, everyone started writing that Danny's death was inevitable, voices merging into a common chorus, and everyone offered their own version of why this ending was the only possible one. Sojun was sure that if he had control, he would be able to come back. There was a ton of criticism in the chat. Streams of messages flashed on the screen, and among them there were so many opinions that my head was spinning. Sojun began to read what was written next, his gaze sliding along the lines, picking out individual phrases, and gradually, from this chaos, a picture of what he needed to do next began to emerge. The audience urged him to hurry to the tavern to see Christina, and these words sounded like a beacon in the fog, and he suddenly felt that he again had a goal to strive for. After the video ended, he was immediately transported to a tavern. The space around him changed, and instead of wild shores and mountains, he found himself in a cozy, warm room that smelled of wood and spices. He slowly opened the door. The hinges creaked softly, and this familiar sound seemed to invite him to enter a new chapter of history. And he found himself inside the establishment. The noise of voices, the clink of mugs, and the dim light enveloped him, returning a feeling of security, albeit illusory. Christina stood behind the counter, her figure straight and collected, and in her every movement one could sense the experience of someone who had seen too much to be surprised by anything. It was immediately obvious that it was necessary to talk to her. She was not just a barmaid, but the key to new tasks, secrets, and opportunities, and it was impossible to ignore her. She noticed his presence out of the corner of her eye. Her gaze slid over him, assessing him, and more words fit into that short second than in long conversations. And she asked what the client wanted. The phrase sounded like a ritual, like a password opening the doors to a world of orders and intrigues, and there was neither warmth nor coldness in her voice, only businesslike manner. Sojun smiled and replied that he wanted many things, but that slight smile hid both fatigue and excitement, and he himself did not know what he wanted more, to rest or to rush into a new adventure. The words came out as automatic lines. The dialogue developed according to a pre-written script. When Christina saw the golden eagle, her gaze changed, her eyes widened, and recognition mixed with alarm flashed in them. And this change spoke louder than any words. Her hands began to tremble, a slight shudder betraying her excitement, and it became clear that this symbol meant much more to her than she was willing to admit. She asked who was in front of her. The question sounded quietly, almost a whisper, and in it one could hear not just politeness, but a genuine need to know the truth. Sojun smiled and replied that he could be of use to her, but there was no boasting in his words, only the calm confidence of a man who knew the value of his skills. Namely, his trump card was the skill of killing. This phrase hung in the air, heavy and frank, showing who she was dealing with.
Christina decided that the mercenary was from the West. Her conclusion sounded like a sentence, and there was a sense of relief in it that she finally understood who was standing in front of her.
He was surprised that she had already heard of him. This fame, which came from nowhere, confused him, and he involuntarily wondered how many legends had already formed around his name. They said that for money he was ready to do anything. In that case, he had no connection with the secret society. To begin, the girl offered to introduce herself. She gave her name and waited for the stranger to respond. He registered himself as Azizun Sojun, deliberately choosing a name similar to his real name so as not to have to come up with a nickname. There was a certain irony in this compromise between reality and the game, and he smiled, imagining the audience guessing about the meaning of this choice. But his character remained as Nameless. Seeing this, the audience began to laugh, that this was some kind of joke. Their laughter rolled through the chat, light and casual, and he realized that even this absurdity had become part of his legend. This pseudonym said nothing about the bearer, and also sounded quite mysterious. It had no pathos, but there was intrigue, and this is what caught people's attention, making them guess and discuss. And he confirmed the name. From that moment on, he could take orders from the tavern, new doors opened before him, and the game world became wider, offering not only battles but also stories to be lived. He asked Christina what he should do to contact her. This question was not just a formality, but an attempt to understand the rules of the new union, and there was genuine interest in his voice. First, she wanted to hear what happened to the owner of the brooch, and he said that he buried him near the West Pier. To communicate, Christina handed him an interesting little thing, her fingers carefully placing the small object on the counter. It was a signal stone. She was glad to work with him. After this, the Nameless left the tavern. The door closed quietly behind him, and he found himself on the street again, ready for new challenges. It seemed he had had enough adventures for today. Fatigue was making itself felt, and even his inner spring, always ready for action, had weakened a little, demanding a break. At this point, he decided to end the stream. The thought of ending it was in the air, and he felt that this day had already given him too many emotions to continue. "I promise to go on air tomorrow at the same time." These words sounded like a promise that connected him with the viewers. Viewers gave me some tips on how to end the broadcast correctly, and their advice came one after another. In one of the windows of the house, a light was shining brightly again. The same warm glow that he had seen at the beginning greeted him again, as if completing a circle and reminding him that even in the wildest adventure, there is always a corner where peace awaits you. Sojun's finger pressed the end button, one short movement, and the screen went dark, cutting off the virtual world from reality. And for a second, there was silence, so rare and precious. All 6 viewers stayed on the broadcast until the very end. Suddenly, he saw a new viewer enter the chat. A line flashed on the screen, and he held his breath for a second, imagining this person who was so eager to see the fighter-style game, but was a little late. He really wanted to see the fighter-style game, but he was late. There was a whole story of anticipation and disappointment hidden in that simple message, and Sojun mentally promised himself that tomorrow he would do everything so that no one left disappointed. The stream's news were full of comments, the feeds were buzzing with heated discussions, and each new message flared up like a spark, igniting another round of debate. Kim was thrilled that the stream had gotten a good reaction. His eyes lit up with excitement, and he was already mentally brainstorming ideas for tomorrow's content, trying to catch this wave and ride it before it died down. But suddenly, Sojun burst into the room. He flew in like a whirlwind, sweeping away the calm atmosphere, and from this suddenness the air seemed to thicken, becoming almost tangible. Taken by surprise, Kim dropped his phone and hit himself in the face. This absurd, almost comical gesture revealed his complete confusion, and for a second they both froze, looking at each other like characters in an absurd scene. Sojun wanted to know why this was happening, and his voice didn't sound irritated but genuinely confused. It was vital for him to understand how the chat continued to bubble and live its own life even after the broadcast ended. But Kim didn't know what to answer. He just spread his hands helplessly, feeling the words slipping away, and there was something almost touching in this confusion. But then he found the reason. The thought flashed like a flash, and he snapped his fingers, finally grasping the very thread that explained everything. Kim showed his neighbor the phone screen. A bright display flashed between them, and a video of Sojun froze on it. There was a video of Sojun. The footage flashed, showing him in the midst of a fight, and in every movement you could see that same bold confidence that captivated the audience from the very first seconds. Kim began to accuse him of using the audience for PR. The phrase sounded harsh, but there was no real anger in it, rather friendly teasing, seasoned with a slight envy of such attention. His comments were full of messages from Sosin Joso, a nickname that kept popping up again and again, as if trying to lead the crowd and set the tone for the entire discussion. At this rate, Sojun could get 30 recommendations, a figure that hung in the air, both enticing and terrifying. And it signified more than just a dry number, but a real breakthrough in the world of streaming. If this happened, subscribers would definitely flock to him. A stream of new faces was inevitable, and this thought simultaneously excited and made him tense. Kim offered his neighbor a friendly stance, suggesting he go to sleep after streaming all night. The advice sounded like simple human concern, and it was as if Kim was trying to get things back on track, reminding him that even legends need rest. But even at night, Sojun couldn't sleep. His mind kept replaying moments of the battle, and his fingers kept reaching for his phone, checking the numbers as they ticked up, as if reality itself depended on it. He watched as the recommendations piled up, each new notification flashing across the screen, like a small firework. And he found himself holding his breath in anticipation of the next number. And then he decided to put the phone away until the morning. With an effort, he moved the screen aside, as if cutting himself off from this digital whirlpool, and tried to convince himself that the morning is wiser than the evening. The next morning dawned. The sun's rays carefully crept through the curtains, and the world, which had recently seemed so complex and confusing, suddenly became simpler and clearer. As Kim predicted, the number of recommendations exceeded 30, a mark that was passed and now became not just a goal, but a fact that had to be taken into account. Suddenly, he saw something interesting. Something flashed among the stream of similar comments that made him stop and read more carefully, as if there was some special meaning hidden in these words. It turned out that many people mistook him for a level 10 bot. This idea seemed ridiculous at first, but the more he thought about it, the more strange, almost frightening meaning he found in it. The Shin-Hai-based bot would typically wait for the user to pick up the sword, a standard behavior pattern that was predictable and measured, like a robot following instructions exactly. But the new bot acted differently. It didn't wait, didn't hide, but rushed into battle, as if choosing the moment to attack itself, and this unpredictability confused even the most experienced players. He would kill anyone who dared to expose himself. These words from the chat sounded like a mixture of admiration and fear, and they accurately described his style: harsh, merciless, and incredibly effective. He also looked down on users. Users considered his personality to be simply brutal. Sojun decided that he had become like this because he had chatted with Kim during the fight and had had a few more fights as a test, although he had not planned it. This chain of coincidences suddenly appeared before him as the reason for all the changes, and he chuckled, realizing how absurdly legends are sometimes born. Because of this, he received a few dislikes. These little minuses unpleasantly scratched his pride. But they were part of the game, and he understood that it was impossible to please everyone without exception. But suddenly, he saw that the comments had already recognized him as Nameless. The phrase sounded like a title, and it contained more recognition than all the likes combined. Sojun himself hadn't expected such attention. He was used to silence and solitary battles, and this flurry of interest seemed almost unreal to him, as if he had fallen into someone else's vivid dream. He considered sudden abundance to be a bad omen. An old habit from his past life made him wary, and he remembered that every rise is often followed by a fall, and therefore he was in no hurry to rejoice. He had come to this conclusion in a previous life. Bitter experience had taught him not to trust overly bright lights, and this caution had become his shield, which he was not going to take off. You just had to keep going day after day. He sat back down in the capsule, the familiar creak and smell of plastic enveloping him, returning him to a familiar reality, where he was once again becoming not just a person, but an avatar, ready for new challenges. And he decided to move forward gradually, as he was accustomed to, without haste, without unnecessary risks, step by step, as if making a path through a dense forest, where danger could lurk behind every tree. As Kim had predicted, his following was growing, but only 6 of them were watching the broadcast live. This small but loyal group was more important to him than thousands of casual viewers, because they were the ones who stayed with him until the end, sharing his every step. Sojun was curious about how many spectators would come this time. There was no vanity in this curiosity. He simply wanted to know that his path was of interest to someone, that someone was watching his every move. Zizun Seojun started the broadcast. The camera turned on, and he paused for a second, collecting his thoughts before plunging back into that maelstrom of voices, expectations, and emotions. This time it was the city of Altjan, huge and multifaceted. It spread out before him, promising new stories and new battles, and its streets beckoned with their mystery and danger. The action of the new level took place in this very city. Every stone, every alley here was part of a puzzle that had to be solved, and the air already seemed heavier with anticipation. It was divided into 4 quarters: the Royal Quarter and the Spire of Aetherius. Gilded Quarter. Lower Quarter. The player could take assassination orders anywhere. The freedom of choice was intoxicating, and one could travel to any corner of the city, following the call of a contract or one's own whim, and this permissiveness was both alluring and terrifying. But there was also the opportunity to kill indiscriminately, and missions in general. This dark side of the game was alluring with its impunity, and everyone decided for themselves which path was closer to them, to follow the rules or to break them. Seojun greeted them with a raised hand, a simple yet meaningful gesture that conveyed respect for those who had come to share the day with him, an acknowledgement of their presence. His followers in the chat responded in kind. A wave of raised hands swept across the screen, and this silent unity was warming, reminding him that he was not alone, that there were people behind him who believed in him. They finally recognized him as the Nameless One. Now, this name sounded not like a lack of personality, but like a mark of distinction, a symbol of someone who had been through a lot and earned his place in this world. This time, the first donations came in, notifications flashed on the screen, and the numbers on the counter trembled, confirming that his work was appreciated not only in words, but also in real actions. It was so unexpected that Sojun even held his breath. For a second, the world shrank to these small icons, and he felt a warm wave of gratitude mixed with slight disbelief rise inside him. In response, he decided to explain better how he dealt with Ittori. He wanted not just to brag, but to share what helped him survive, to turn his experience into a lesson for others so that someone else could avoid his mistakes. You could aim for vital spots, which angered him and broke his concentration. The essence of tactics lay in these details, and he broke the fight down into its components, as if he were disassembling a complex mechanism to show how everything worked from the inside. There were a lot of nicknames that Sojun hadn't seen before, and he decided to see how many viewers had gathered. The cursor slid to the corner of the screen, and the number he saw made his heart beat a little faster, driving away the last of his doubts. This time, 327 people watched it, and that number was like music to the ears, and it meant that his story had resonated in the hearts of hundreds of people, and that thought gave him strength. He decided to ask everyone what they should do today. This question was not just a formality, but an attempt to make the audience part of his journey, to make them feel that their opinions matter, that they influence the course of events. The audience was waiting for him to show off his fighting style. Their impatience was permeating the chat, and they were eager to see the same magic that made his fights unforgettable, the same audacity that made hearts skip a beat. He noted that the youth today were energetic, and in that slight smile one could hear respect for their passion. Looking at this, a thought came to Sojun's mind. The sun was still high, and to warm up, he decided to rummage through his pockets. A drunk man walked down the street, his steps uneven. He kept bumping into invisible walls, and his every movement was tinged with tired bravado, as if he were challenging the entire city at once. And suddenly, he saw a man in a black hood. A figure emerged from the semi-darkness, like a clot of shadow, and for a second, the world seemed to shrink to this meeting, crossing out everything unnecessary. He started to pick on him and tell him to watch where he was going. His voice sounded hoarse and broken. It was not so much anger that one could hear in it, but a desperate need to prove that he still meant something. But they still dispersed in the crowd. The flow of people picked them up and carried them in different directions, and in a moment there was no trace left of this flash, as if it had never happened. The man in the black hood remembered him. The image was frozen in his memory like a still from an old film, and he knew that someday this meeting would play its role again. Sojun adjusted his interception technique slightly, and everything went like clockwork. The movements became a little sharper, a little more precise, and this subtle change turned a risky maneuver into a flawless combination. He managed to commit 3 thefts in a row, each time his fingers deftly slipped out of the pockets of his victims, leaving behind only slight bewilderment and emptiness where the valuable cargo had lain just a second ago. But stealing was more fun when the city guard was on your tail. That adrenaline rush, that sharp taste of danger made every theft not just a matter of business, but a real art, a game with death. With so much money, you could forget about hunger. The heavy bags felt pleasantly heavy in your pockets, and this heaviness felt not like a burden, but like freedom. Like the opportunity to not think about tomorrow. Suddenly, someone called out to Sojun. It was some stranger. There was nothing remarkable about his appearance, but there was a sense of menace in the way he stood, and this made him far more dangerous than any guard. Sojun stopped and asked if he was the one he was talking to. There was no fear in the question, only the cold calculation of a man who was used to calculating every step and did not like surprises. 2 strangers decided to ask him what he was doing there. Their words sounded polite, but behind that politeness there was steel, and Sojun immediately realized that these weren't random passers-by, but the owners of these streets. After all, as it turned out, he needed to ask their permission for such things. This simple phrase ruined his entire plan, and suddenly he felt like a boy who stuck his nose where he didn't belong. Sojun asked if they meant the bags of money, trying to save face, and his cheeky question suggested an attempt to turn a threat into a deal. He had grabbed a good amount, so he had to share. This bitter truth hung in the air, and he realized that today luck had decided to turn its back on him. It turned out that in this game he was being pursued not by the guards, but by his own thieving brothers. The irony of the situation hit him harder than any blow, because betrayal always hurts more than someone else's enmity. These were the disassemblers. The name sounded like a death sentence. And now everything fell into place. These streets, these rules, this cruel hierarchy in which he was just a newcomer. The audience suggested that defeating their boss became the goal of the new game. Advice flashed on the screen, and a clear goal suddenly emerged from the chaos of opinions, giving meaning and direction to the situation. They were already looking for someone. Shadows were scurrying through the alleys, and the air was filled with tension, as if the city was holding its breath in anticipation of the outcome. After all, they were sure that he could not have gone far. This confidence of the pursuers was oppressive, and even in the most secluded corners one could feel that there was no escape from them. Veteran streamer Alpaca was hiding in a chandelier while doing a kill for a gun challenge. His pose was ridiculous and desperate, and there was something almost heroic in this absurd scene. But there were no options here. The situation looked hopeless, and even his experience could not help him get out of this trap. The candles on the chandelier burned with a bright flame. The lights trembled, casting strange shadows, and in their light everything seemed a little unreal, like a set for a play. A drop of wax fell directly on the disassembler's head. This tiny accident upset the balance, and sometimes it is such small things that decide the outcome of great events. Looking up, he saw Alpaca. The moment stretched out, and in that look there was everything: surprise, anger, and the inevitability of pursuit. At this point the game was over. This wasn't the first time he'd fallen for these bandits. It wasn't just a defeat, but part of his story. A series of failures from which he tried to learn at least some lesson. It was the fourth failure, a number that sounded bitter, but it also reminded us that every failure is a step towards victory if you have enough strength to rise. If only he could take down Drake, Sector 4 would be clear. The thought burned inside him, and it was both a hope and a curse, because Drake remained out of reach. But this was very difficult to do because the rulers were invincible by default. The Queen was one of them, and also the Lord of the Spire of Aetherius, and also the leader of the King's followers. And the boss of the disassemblers is Drake. The last one was difficult to find, as he appeared randomly in one of 10 bases. This unpredictability made hunting him like a game of blind luck, where luck meant more than skill. Alpaca made a deal at the trading window and bought a secret disassembler card. The coins were slipping away like water through his fingers, but this purchase could be the key to a long-awaited victory. He could use it to track Drake's whereabouts. The thin lines on the parchment promised to reveal the secret, and in that moment the whole world narrowed down to this map and the next target. This time he was in a place called The Group. It was a place where it was difficult to get. Viewers advised Alpaca to switch to a fighting style like Nameless. Alpaca thanked him for the donation, but replied that such a style was unrealistic. His voice betrayed respect for the skill of the Nameless one, and, at the same time, doubt in his own abilities. But the audience quickly dissuaded him. The flow of messages rushed forward, and in every word there was an energy that did not allow him to give up. Alpaca was very surprised that someone in the community had managed this. The thought boggled his mind, and he was still trying to comprehend that the impossible was possible. He even promised to serve this player if he trained him. The words sounded solemn, like an oath, and they held more sincerity than any assurances. Alpaca confirmed his words to the audience. He looked straight into the camera, and in his gaze one could see the determination that was more convincing than any words. Although I still didn't believe that this was even true, the audience started laughing at him, thinking he was scared. The laughter flowed through the chat, light and merciless, and it contained that very game cruelty that made you become stronger. But the donations kept coming, and he had no choice. The numbers on the counter grew, and along with them, the understanding grew stronger. He had to live up to expectations, even if he had to go above and beyond. A whole crowd was chasing the stranger. The stamping of feet and shouts merged into a single menacing roar, and it seemed as if the city itself had risen up against him. They tried to stop him at any cost. There was no room for pity in their determination, and each of them was ready to pay any price for his capture. And Sojun just looked at them with a smirk. Not long before, the four had been leading Sojun in an unknown direction, their footsteps echoing loudly in the narrow alleys, and each turn only intensified the oppressive feeling that he was being dragged towards something inevitable. The atmosphere was very oppressive. The air seemed heavy, filled with menace, and even the rare cries of nightbirds sounded like dark omens. He heard them talking about how they were just going with the flow, and there was a tired resignation in their words, and Sojun couldn't help but wonder how many more of these poor souls they had led like this, without purpose or meaning. The audience told him that in order to get information about Drake, he needed to complete a couple of routine missions. Advice flashed on the screen, and there was simple logic in them that suddenly seemed like a lifeline in this chaos. After all, as it turned out, he was hunting for the ruler. This thought hit his consciousness like a heavy hammer, and suddenly all the previous battles took on a new, much more serious meaning. This information puzzled Sojun a little. He froze for a second, trying to wrap his head around the fact that what was at stake now wasn't just survival, but a confrontation with someone who stood at the top of this entire criminal pyramid. The spectators began asking how he was going to hunt, having no idea who the ruler was. A stream of questions poured in one after another, and in each of them one could hear genuine bewilderment mixed with excitement. But the ridicule continued in the chat. In fact, last night, he had a great look at who Drake was, but each option was fraught with consequences. So the choice was difficult. The memories of those pages came flooding back, and he again felt that chill that ran down his spine when he realized the scale of the threat. Then the idea occurred to him that if he crippled these people, they would forget about pursuing him. The thought was harsh, but in this cruel world it sounded almost like common sense, and he did not drive it away. For now, they were asking him nicely to give them everything he had. There were still notes of hope in their voices that it would be done without bloodshed, and this false politeness only irritated him more. And including the stolen wallets, this demand sounded especially ridiculous, and Sojun barely held back a bitter laugh. They wanted to take back what he had already paid for with his peace of mind and nerves. Sojun wasn't the least bit surprised by this. He'd long since realized that kindness was rare in this city, and greed ruled the streets far more confidently than kings. The thieves demanded that the goods be given to them immediately. Their voices became increasingly harsh, and the air clearly smelled of an approaching fight. But they saw that it would probably end in a fight. Understanding flashed in their eyes, and the tension between them and Sojun became almost palpable, like a taut string ready to snap. After these words, Sojun became truly angry. A fire that he had been suppressing for so long flared up inside him, and now he was ready to throw out this rage in movements that were fast and deadly. And suddenly he asked these guys point blank if they knew where Drake was. The question sounded sharp, like the blow of a whip, and for a second even the thieves froze, confused by such impudence. They knew, of course, but they weren't going to tell him about it. Their smirks were superior, and they clearly enjoyed holding in their hands not only his things, but also the information he needed. Then Sojun confirmed that there would be a beating here. The phrase sounded calm, almost casual, and from this confidence in his voice, the thieves' backs involuntarily went cold. The thieves didn't quite understand what he was saying. They looked at each other, trying to figure out whether he was joking or was really ready to challenge four of them at once. And they decided to teach him a good lesson. Their fists clenched, and the first of them stepped forward, confident that now everything would end quickly and clearly. But Sojun jumped high into the air, his body flying into the air as if thrown by an invisible spring, and this unexpected maneuver threw his opponents off their stride for a second. And he landed right behind the bandits, softly like a cat, and now he was looking at their backs. And in this change of position one could feel the whole essence of his style, unpredictability and speed. This trick made them even more angry. Now their rage was not only irritation, but also resentment for having been so easily deceived, and this made them even more dangerous. One of them wanted to stab Sojun with a knife. The blade flashed in the dim light, and the moment stretched out, turning into an eternity where every movement decided everything. But he managed to deftly dodge. His body slid to the side as if water were flowing around a stone, and the blow passed by without causing any harm. And the bandit himself found himself on the ground, his legs treacherously parted, and he collapsed without having time to understand what had happened. And his weapon ended up in the hands of the enemy. The cold metal lay in Sojun's palm, and now the balance of power had finally shifted in his favor. The second of the bandits also rushed into the attack, rage giving him courage, and he rushed forward, waving his fists as if trying to crush the enemy with her sheer weight. But the Nameless was able to easily parry his blow. The movement was almost careless, and that made it seem even more frightening, demonstrating the difference in their levels. The bandit stood there, dumbfounded, his eyes wide with incomprehension, and he suddenly realized that this was no ordinary thief, but someone far more dangerous. And Seo-jun's eyes were full of determination. There was no malice or pleasure in them, only the cold focus of a man who knows what he must do and is willing to pay any price. And he stabbed his opponent with a knife, sharply, precisely, without unnecessary emotion, and this blow put an end to their confrontation. The next one suffered the same fate, the equipment worked without fail, and each new enemy fell without having time to realize how quickly it was all over. Seo-jun emerged victorious from this fight once again, his chest heaving with tension, but inside him a familiar feeling of triumph mixed with fatigue was spreading. Everyone in the chat was impressed by the fighter's style. Emojis flashed across the screen, and viewers were generous with their praise, admitting that the fight was a real spectacle. One of the bandits raised himself slightly from the ground, trying to escape. Even after everything he had been through, his instinct for self-preservation drove him away, and he crawled, clinging to the stones, just to get away from this nightmare. But the Nameless one caught up with him, and holding a knife in his hands, he asked where Drake was. But he didn't want to answer for anything. His lips were pressed into a thin line, and his gaze showed a stubborn determination to take this secret with him to the grave. Seo-jun's blow was so powerful that the vibrations spread throughout his entire body. He wasn't joking, and asked his question again. Now there was no hint of leniency left in his words, and the bandit realized that the next blow could be the last. Sojun demanded an answer and already raised the knife above his head. The tip stopped a centimeter from the skin, and time seemed to stop, obeying the will of the Nameless one. With the last of his strength, the bandit replied that their boss was on 13th Street. The words came out in a hoarse whisper, and they carried the desperation of a man who had just sold his loyalty for a few extra minutes of life. Where the largest group was located. After such a victory, everyone in the chat was jubilant. Twisting the blade in his hand, Sojun noticed that it was a bit short and awkward to hold. The metal slid uncomfortably in his palm, and he realized that for the coming battle he needed a weapon worthy of his skill. And he decided to get himself a more decent weapon. The idea took shape instantly, and he already knew where to look for what he needed, and this search became part of his plan. He found an option that suited him. A whole crowd was already chasing him. The shouts and stamping of feet merged into a single menacing roar, and it seemed that the entire city had risen up against him, trying to stop him at any cost. But Sojun had no intention of giving up. Each of his blows knocked back one enemy. The technique worked like clockwork, and the enemies fell one after another, unable to withstand his speed and accuracy. He dealt with them all, with scraps of metal pipe, not the most noble weapon, but in skilled hands even a piece of iron became a deadly instrument. He hadn't noticed that the developers were truly ruthless. Only now did he realize that this wave of enemies was not a coincidence, but a deliberate test designed to test his strength. After all, they had packed the theater with a mountain of 30 people and ordered them all to be killed. This thought came to him belatedly, and he involuntarily grinned. It meant the game had decided to test him to the fullest, and he had accepted this challenge. But it turned out pretty well. Suddenly, a sharp knife flew past Sojun's face like an arrow, flashing through the air, shiny and deadly, and time froze for a second, causing him to hold his breath. And it pierced the wall behind him, the sound of the impact echoing, and this ominous sign clearly said the battle was far from over, and far more dangerous opponents awaited him ahead. Turning around, he saw dozens of knives flying at him. He knelt down, clutching the pipe tighter in his hand. The metal dug into his fingers, but the pain only heightened his senses, turning his grip into steel, unbreakable. And he deflected every weapon thrown at him, each swing of the pipe merging into a single whirlwind, and in this frantic series of movements one could see a technique honed over years and not just a desperate attempt to survive. In the chat, everyone considered this a top-notch reaction. Suddenly, heavy footsteps were heard behind him. It was Drake. He too appreciated his fight, his gaze cold and tenacious, not showing admiration, but the calculating interest of a man who was used to measuring the value of others by their strength. But he had something else in store for his opponent. A barely noticeable smile touched his lips, and in this gesture there was a promise of pain that sent an unpleasant chill down his spine. And he launched another 10 blades towards Sojun, the blades flying from his fingers like angry wasps and rushing forward, glittering in the dim light like small lightning bolts. They flew with a whistle, cutting through the air. This sound was absorbed into the ears, becoming part of the rhythm of the fight, and each whistle meant another moment and everything will be over. There were a huge number of them, but Sojun was not afraid of this. He looked at the flying steel without panic, as if these blades were not a threat, but another exam that he had to pass. He spun the broken pipe like a fan blade. The metal sang as it cut through the air, and an invisible wall appeared before him, capable of stopping even death itself. And he pointed it straight at the knives. The movement was sharp, confident, and in it one could feel absolute faith in his own strength, which sometimes meant more than any weapon. None of them ever reached their target. The blades bounced, rang, fell, and this series of misses looked almost mocking, as if fate itself had sided with the Nameless one. But then one of the knives returned to its owner and cut his face, a scarlet stripe flashing on the skin. In the chat, everyone was discussing how the Nameless one could even parry flying projectiles. A stream of messages rushed forward, and in every word, one could hear amazement mixed with delight, as if the audience had witnessed something impossible. Drake assessed his fighting ability and asked his name. The question sounded unexpectedly calm, and in this silence after the storm, there was something almost respectful. And he replied that he was Nameless. After a short silence, Drake said that he had a good name, too. These words sounded like a confession, and they did not exude kindness, but rather the cold respect of the strong for the strong. This meant that he was going for broke. Excitement flashed in his eyes, and now he was going to throw everything he had into the battle, leaving neither himself nor his opponent the right to make a mistake. More projectiles flew towards Sojun. A whole barrage of metal fell upon him, and it seemed that even his incredible reflexes could not cope with such an onslaught. But he was still able to repel them with the same ease. The pipe flashed in the air, turning into a blur, and each repelled blade only confirmed that this was not an ordinary fighter, but a legend. But suddenly, a sharp tip on a chain was rushing towards him from behind, the cold edge rushing in an arc, and this maneuver was so unexpected that even Sojun's heart stopped for a second. Sensing this, Sojun kicked the thread away, the movement instinctive, honed to the point of automatism, and there was not a drop of doubt in it, only the pure reaction of a master. He even decided that it would be easier with this boss than with Ittori. The thought flashed and immediately crumbled, because the very next second reality cruelly refuted his confidence. But this weapon was the reason why it was difficult to handle. The chains had a life of their own, writhing like snakes, and their every movement carried a threat that could not be ignored. Enormous, sharp stones held tightly by forged chains. The structure looked like an engineer's nightmare, heavy, unpredictable, and deadly, capable of breaking even the strongest defenses. Sojun thought the developers had gone overboard with the weapon design, and there was a bitter smile that held both irritation and admiration. They had created something so complex that the battle with this boss became a real test of strength. Smiling, Drake asked if he wanted to attack first. There was no kindness in that smile, only the predatory excitement of a hunter who was already anticipating how he would tear his prey to pieces. Since the enemy didn't respond, he decided to do it himself. Drake wasn't used to waiting, and his patience was as sharp as his blades. so he wasn't going to give Sojun a second to think. The pipe was Sojun's only weapon, a simple, crude piece that in his hands became something more than just a weapon, an extension of his will, his rage, his destiny. Even with it in his hands, he was capable of fighting well. Skill did not depend on the quality of the blade, and he proved this time and again, turning weakness into strength. But Drake's weapon didn't give him a second to relax. Chains flashed, stones thundered, and the space around him contracted, not allowing him to step aside or catch his breath. He attacked like a madman, without logic, without system, just pure pressure that was supposed to break anyone who dared to stand in his way. This boss was definitely more difficult than those 13 opponents in a row. The difference was not in quantity, but in quality. One Drake was worth an entire army, and this was felt in every blow he struck. But Sojun had survived mountains of blades and forests of swords, and he knew the key to survival. He decided to break through and close the distance. The plan was risky, almost insane, but it was precisely in such decisions that victories were born, which were then remembered for centuries. Drake hesitated slightly, his perfect rhythm faltering for a split second, and that moment was enough for Sojun to realize he had a chance. But he wasn't going to give in to him so easily. The boss shook himself, and his rage flared up with renewed vigor, ready to devour anyone who dared to hope for victory. Sojun began throwing punches, each one measured as if he weren't fighting, but writing poetry in the language of violence, where every word mattered. He used a parry. This technique could push away simple mobs in an instant, but against a boss it only bought a moment for one attack. And in this race for moments, everything was decided. Life or death, victory or defeat. Even now the chains protected him, making it difficult to land any blow. But that didn't concern Sojun. After all, he just had to hit hard. Those words summed up his entire philosophy. Sometimes you don't need complex strategies, just one precise, powerful blow that will turn the tide of battle. It was a stance he had repeated tens of thousands of times while swinging his sword. It had become ingrained in his muscles, a part of his body, and now he could adopt it even in his sleep, without thinking for a second. It was a high-security stand. The next moment, he struck the man on the head 3 times with the pipe, sharply and mercilessly. Everyone in the chat was taken aback by this turn of events. For a second, the flow of comments froze, and viewers, in disbelief, tried to comprehend. Was this really happening? Could he really have done it? The key to this attack was the legwork. It was what provided the power and direction, and without it, even the most powerful swing would have been useless. And by turning his body, he added inertia, turning the blow into a crushing wave that was impossible to stop. And the trajectory of the swing mattered. The wrong angle could cost the victory, and he knew this better than anyone else. The body itself didn't matter. It didn't matter how strong or resilient you were. If your technique was poor, you would lose, and that rule was immutable. But even now, Sojun never let Drake's weapons out of his sight. He saw every chain, every movement, and his mind recorded the smallest details, turning danger into an advantage. The chains flew towards him again, writhing in the air as if they were alive, and in their movement one could feel the evil will of the boss himself, who was not going to give up. The boss was furious. His eyes blazed with rage, and now this was not a game, not a test, but a personal feud in which there could be no compromise. He only wanted the death of his enemy. Sojun hooked his pipe into one of the chains, metal clanging against metal. He jerked her forward. The effort was monstrous, and his muscles howled with tension, but he didn't pay attention to it because now only one thing mattered: victory. And then he swung with all his might. The movement was so powerful that it seemed as if he was putting his whole life, every second of his existence, into it. And the chain broke. This sharp sound sounded like a victorious chord, and in it one could hear not just the breaking of metal, but the collapse of the boss's plans, his confidence, his power. It was funny. A small smile played at the corners of his lips, because even in the midst of this mortal battle, he knew how to find moments that made the heart beat faster with pure excitement. Every swing of Sojun's weapon carried a significant detail. They contained years of training, spilled sweat, broken bones, and an unbending will that made him who he became. This was proof of the reality of his past life. Every movement confirmed that he was not a random person, not a newbie, but a warrior who had been through real hell. And in this battle he had to emerge victorious. Again, it was not a wish or a hope. It was a necessity, the only possible outcome, which he accepted without hesitation. Sojun dealt his opponent a critical blow, the final chord of this symphony of steel and fury, and it contained the essence of his path. To go to the end, without looking back or doubting. Drake's life hung in the balance. One false breath and it would all be over, and in that fragile line between life and death, the full weight of the moment was felt.
This mission has been completed.
Now, Nameless had definitely become the star of the stream. His name was already being whispered in every corner of the virtual world, and it was becoming a legend that would be retold again and again. The number of his subscribers increased, the numbers on the counter grew, and each new subscription was not just a number, but recognition, evidence that his path found a response in people's hearts. The number was even higher than the current number of subscribers. Kim had taught him not to focus on viewer numbers, his words echoing old wisdom proven by years of streaming, and he'd repeated it so often that it had become almost a mantra, but for some reason, it wasn't working today. But Sojun couldn't help but rejoice. Everything inside him was jubilant, and he saw no point in hiding this joy because such moments didn't happen every day and deserved to be felt to the fullest. This was the first time he'd played through the game in this spirit, and he himself couldn't quite believe he'd managed to pull it off exactly like that, without any extra hints or cheats, just pure skill and instinct, which sometimes saved him better than any map. And in the chat, the enthusiastic reviews continued. The stream of messages rushed forward, and each word echoed warmly somewhere inside, reminding him that he didn't just fight, but gave people emotions. For such an epic battle, he received donations again. Notifications flashed on the screen, and they weren't just money, but a sign of recognition, a small thank you from those sitting on the other side of the screen. But Sojun had a question. He froze for a second, and this question, quiet and insistent, broke through all this noise and delight, demanding an answer. He wondered where all the guards had gone. This discrepancy scratched his consciousness like a splinter, and he could not understand why, at such an important moment, the city seemed to have died out. Spectators explained that they don't come out during raids. Someone's hint popped up in the chat, and everything immediately fell into place, as if an invisible lock had clicked, closing this little mystery. They were only good at chasing pickpockets. This simple truth sounded almost offensive, and it felt like the irony of the game itself, which loved to throw out such bitter pills. Now everything became clear to Sojun. He nodded to himself, and the tension that had been quietly building up in his shoulders finally subsided, giving way to clarity. He had to decide where to go next. Dozens of paths diverged before him, each promising its own dangers and rewards, and so he had to choose carefully, weighing every step. Suddenly, someone stopped the Nameless one. He asked who was hiding under the hood. It turned out to be Christina. She handed him a bag of coins. After all, thanks to him, they stopped putting pressure on them. She sincerely thanked him for his help. There was not a drop of falsehood in her voice, and this simplicity touched him much more than all the donations put together. After this, Sojun's reputation grew. Even though he didn't take on the mission to capture Drake, he still received a reward. Christina asked where he would go now. Sojun asked why she needed this information. Without waiting for an answer, she said goodbye and said that they would see each other again. Her smile was light, almost weightless, and she disappeared into the semi-darkness of the alley, leaving behind only the feeling of something important, almost said. Sojun watched her go. The assassination attempt was successful. The surrounding area was a scene of complete devastation, with debris, bloodstains, and scattered objects reminiscent of the recent storm. And the very air seemed to still vibrate with the echoes of the battle. People in the chat started asking if he even knew what an assassination attempt was, and someone in the audience noticed an inconsistency, and this caustic comment scratched out, reminding him that even in the virtual world, you can't please everyone. At this point, Sojun decided to end the stream. Fatigue was rolling in waves, and he understood that if he didn't stop now, he would start making mistakes that he would be embarrassed to watch again later. But the viewers didn't want to let him go and asked him to continue at least a little longer. The stream of requests flowed endlessly, and in it one could hear that very devotion that made the stream worth it in the first place. But he still switched off, saying goodbye until next time. He forced himself to press the button, although his fingers seemed to resist, and in this farewell there was a promise that he intended to keep. Tired, he climbed out of the capsule. The world around him swam for a second, and the familiar room seemed alien, as if he had returned from a long journey to a completely different world. The first thing he saw was Kim's worried face. This apathetic face made him nervous. It turned out that he had been watching Sojun's stream the whole time. Well, he didn't like that he was doing it in his room. After Sojun had vented, he decided to ask his neighbor how he was enjoying his stream. He suddenly felt it was important to hear an honest opinion, even if it wasn't the most pleasant, because that was the only way to move forward. For 440 spectators, it was not bad. Sojun snatched the phone from Kim's hands. The movement was abrupt, almost nervous, and he was surprised at his own impatience. But curiosity had already gotten the better of his fatigue. And he decided to watch the recording again. The screen flashed, and before him again unfolded the same battle that had recently been his reality, but had now turned into a set of pixels and frames. He reread all the comments again, lines flashing before his eyes, and among hundreds of words he tried to pick out the main thing. What would help him become better and more interesting for his audience? It turned out that no one had ever heard of such an item as the fragment of the order that he received for killing Drake. This detail suddenly became the center of attention, and he realized that he had accidentally discovered some hidden layer of the game that only a few knew about. It could only be obtained by completing the quest in the fighter style, a stipulation in the item description that sounded like a personal dedication, and it made its achievement even more valuable, almost unique. But with the fans came the haters into Sojun's life. Among the enthusiastic reviews, caustic comments flashed, and they stung like small but evil wasps, reminding him that popularity is not only about applause, but also about criticism. It was impossible to be happy with only positive reviews. He asked Kim how he should respond to haters, but he only had 440 viewers, and the community was over 10,000 strong. Kim spoke calmly, without pomp, and these numbers were like a cold shower bringing him back down to earth. Kim hinted that he needed to become even more popular. I just had to figure out how to do it. And Sojun came up with the idea of using alpaca for this. He saw the recordings of his last stream, and he decided to make him answer for his words. To achieve his goal, he decided to use his neighbor. After that, he came to Kimtewa, and I asked him if he knew a streamer named Alpaca. He said that, of course he did. Then Sojun asked him for a favor. The words were not easy to say, because asking is always more difficult than taking it yourself, but he understood that he couldn't do without help. Alpaca failed again at one stage of the course, and the footage showed him frozen in indecision, and this moment of weakness looked almost touching, despite all his reputation. This was already the 13th time. He couldn't understand. Despite his reputation as a killer of other NPCs, he should have had no problem finishing off this Drake. Alpaca's internal monologue was audible even through the screen, and it sounded like the desperation of a man who was not used to losing. And in the comments, they continued to laugh at him. The stream of ridicule flowed without stopping, and each new comment seemed to drive another nail into the lid of his confidence. His lobby's mascot was an alpaca with a red bow and a bell. It was a gift from his fans, and in this gift there was a sense of genuine support, which now seemed almost like mockery, because reality did not want to live up to expectations. He sincerely believed that he came to support him, but got spat in the face. This caused an even greater wave of ridicule. In the comments, everyone started writing that he was just chilling out. He received a new donation of 10,000 won, but a viewer reminded him of his promise from the previous stream. The alpaca was very surprised that someone could actually do this. Viewers sent him a link to a fighter-style walkthrough. After watching the recording, Alpaca decided that they were simply making fun of him because he considered the idea absurd. But the video of the nameless stream of Drake's murder told a different story. The image was clear, the movements were flawless, and it became increasingly difficult to deny the reality of what was happening. Alpaca couldn't quite believe that someone had managed to do this. He also really wanted to find out what kind of player this was. Curiosity fought with pride, and, in the end, curiosity won out. Suddenly he saw a new letter in his possession. He opened it immediately. The content of the message surprised him very much. Sojun wrote to him from Kim Tae-woo's account and asked to talk to him. Simple words, but they were filled with a challenge. And Alpaca suddenly realized that his story was just beginning, not ending. The office of the company, Moviesoft, was located in one of the towers. There was a pleasant smell of coffee in the office. The company's CEO, Yves Paimon, decided to take a short break. He savored, inhaling the aroma of his drink. Suddenly, the door of his office swung open and a broken employee appeared on the threshold. Yves didn't like this behavior at all, but he still decided to ask what happened. But the reason for such an invasion was truly grandiose. One of the rulers was defeated, and in the style of a fighter, no less. Yves tensed up and asked who exactly it was. The employee replied that it was Drake. These words calmed the director, because Drake was the weakest of them all, and it was high time he was defeated. The employee was worried that people would start to take an interest in the fragments of the order, but Yves hastened to reassure him, saying that their plans would only be hampered by collecting all the fragments. But he himself developed a system that would prevent this from happening. The fragment of the order was in hidden items. It could only be obtained by defeating one of the rulers in a special way. This item only dropped when winning in fighter style. The Key Lord could not be defeated without special skills. The user had to spend quite a lot of time to open it, and this meant that there was no reason to worry yet. But no one knew what could happen, because the player who did this had just started streaming. Eva was not very interested in listening to this, and he asked the employee to return to work. But then, suddenly, the meaning of his words dawned on him. It turned out that his employees were watching streams at work. The poor fellow had no choice but to beg for mercy. Ivu didn't like this behavior at all. Alpaca reminded his friend that there would be a stream and collaboration today. Sukhan was skeptical that the video footage of the newcomer would be of any interest. But he was a little mistaken, because this newcomer was supposed to be more than just a guest. He was supposed to give a masterclass. But Sukhan could not share Alpaca's enthusiasm on this matter. Although he had seen the video, he thought it was something remarkable. He reminded them that their goal was the League. Alpaca asked her friend for his capsule for Sojun, but he reminded her that he had a spare one. But Sojun's synchronization level was low, so the new model was suitable for him, but Suhan was not willing to give it up at all. As he was leaving, he asked to be told when the guest would appear so he could see the audience's reactions. And then something dawned on Alpaca. It turned out that Sojun did all this on inappropriate equipment, and it was scary to even think about how cool he was in reality. He even thought that the collaboration was actually a bad idea. But it was already late and the doorbell rang. The frightened Alpaca opened the door. Sojun stood at the threshold of his house.